Hey everyone! Before we get into it, please hit the subscribe button and drop a like. It helps me out a lot and contributes a lot to the channel. Now let's get into it. I hope you enjoy. The wind whispered through the tall pines encircling the sprawling Silvercrest territory, sending soft currents of fragrance through the clearing. Nightfall was painting the sky in shades of blue and black, and the moon was just beginning its ascent behind the branches. The quiet hush of nature blanketed the land, but for an Omega named Ember, that hushed presence was even more profound. She had spent most of her life like this, half in shadow, half in the spaces that no one else cared to fill. She had long accepted her place in the pack hierarchy, and that acceptance had sharpened into a form of invisible armor. Omegas were not to be seen or heard, not to be praised or cherished. She was used to that. She knew it intimately, as well as she knew the scent of pine in the winter or the taste of wild berries in early spring. But deep inside her, there was a tiny ember of longing, a secret flicker she had never managed to extinguish. The longing to belong, to be accepted, maybe even to be loved. She never dared to voice that desire, not even when her body trembled at night from frustration and loneliness. To express such a yearning was fruitless. No Omega would ever be someone's mate. They were the laborers, the scapegoats, and occasionally the silent observers, but never the partners of alphas. That was simply reality. So Ember did her duties without complaint. She was unremarkable in the eyes of her peers, her voice never rising above what was expected from someone of her rank. She had no illusions that she would ever ascend beyond the label the pack had pressed onto her from birth. It stung sometimes, late at night, when she closed her eyes and pictured the future that might have been. But she rarely indulged in those fantasies, for if she did, it would make facing each day's burdens all the harder. That night, she was walking through the pack's main clearing, head bowed low, as she carried a stack of fresh linens from one side of the settlement to the other. The frayed linen edges brushed her arms, leaving faint impressions on her skin. She was on her way to the laundry shed after a long day of chores, and her muscles were aching with a dull throb that never seemed to go away. Shadows were pooling across the ground, elongated by the moonlight. Her footsteps were silent, her presence nearly forgotten. There were a few wolves nearby, but their attention was everywhere except on the small-framed girl quietly rushing through her last tasks for the day. It was a busy night at Silvercrest, for the pack had been in a restless state ever since their alpha, Killian, returned from a summit that gathered the most influential alphas of the region. Whispers circulated among the wolves about territory disputes and precarious alliances forming on the horizon. Ember had heard only scraps of rumor and bits of conversation gleaned when she was cleaning or serving food. Most of it was likely none of her concern, and yet she found herself listening all the same. Part of her was curious about the troubles that kept the pack on edge. Tension always trickled down to the lowest ranks, and that meant she might have even more tasks and pressures placed upon her if the pack was forced to mobilize or if hostility broke out. Balancing the stack of linens carefully in her arms, Ember continued onward, careful not to misstep over the exposed roots that wove across the clearing. She kept her eyes down and her mind focused. If she completed these final tasks, she could slip away to her small corner of the communal Omega sleeping quarters. At least then, she would have a moment of quiet to reflect on her day, and she could let her imagination wander for a few precious minutes before collapsing into exhausted sleep. But this night, fate had other plans. As she rounded the bend near the central bonfire pit, her gaze fell upon a group of pack members gathered on the far side. She noticed Beta Lucien and Gamma Sybil whispering in low voices, their hands gesturing with an urgency that suggested some recent news had ruffled them. At the heart of the group, commanding attention just by standing there, was Alpha Killian himself. He was tall, with eyes the color of smoldering embers, and there was a regal sharpness to his features that seemed perfectly suited to leadership. Even from a distance, his presence radiated enough power to make the night air tingle. Ember's heartbeat quickened instinctively. The Alpha was rarely out in the open with the rest of the pack in such a casual way, especially not after returning from a tense diplomatic summit. She quickly dipped her head, deciding it was best to give the group a wide berth. She had no reason to linger. She had no desire to catch anyone's notice, most especially not the Alpha's. So she kept her eyes glued to her burden, forcing herself to ignore the subtle thrumming of her wolf sense that told her something about this night was different. Something intangible was crackling in the atmosphere. But whether out of nerves or fatigue, she let her focus falter for 1 second too long. Her foot struck a tangle of roots, and she stumbled, the stack of linen slipping from her arms. They landed on the hard ground with a muffled thump. A puff of dust rose around her ankles. Embarrassed, she scrambled to gather them back up, internally cursing at her own clumsiness. She hoped no one had noticed, but a glance toward the group near the fire pit told her otherwise. Several faces had turned in her direction. Among them were the Beta, the Gamma, and, impossibly, Alpha Killian himself. She froze, the pulse in her throat hammering wildly. The moment stretched. His gaze bored into hers for just a fraction of a second. She could have sworn something sparked in those intense eyes. An expression of curiosity? Maybe even concern? But the flicker was gone before she could fully identify it. Quickly, she tore her gaze away, resuming her frantic collection of the scattered linens, and rose to her feet as gracefully as she could manage. She wanted to hide behind her dark hair and melt into the background, but she also knew that ignoring the Alpha's presence was not wise. With a trembling breath, she dipped her head in respect. Killian nodded in response, his voice unexpectedly gentle as he said, "Careful. Just that one word." Ember swallowed. Her cheeks were burning. She murmured an apology so quietly she wasn't sure if he had heard it. Then she darted away before the pack stairs could weigh on her any further. It wasn't until she had put significant distance between herself and the Alpha that she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. It was dangerous to be caught in the Alpha's gaze, even if momentarily, especially for someone of her rank. Still, for a long time afterward, her mind kept returning to that one fleeting word and the strange warmth in Killian's gaze. She found herself replaying that moment while she tucked the linens in the laundry shed, while she tidied up the storeroom before calling it a night, and even later as she laid down on the thin pallet in the Omega's quarters. She wanted to dismiss it as a trivial kindness, a passing flicker of acknowledgement from the Alpha who merely didn't want to see his pack members hurt. But her wolf sense, caged within her, refused to let go of that moment. Her instincts were scraping at the inside of her consciousness, hinting that something about that single exchange was important. She tried to push the thought away, but it loomed in her dreams, like a silent figure in the dark. The next morning dawned bright, the sun casting a warm glow across the rolling fields and the forest beyond. Ember was on her feet before most of her fellow Omegas stirred. She always liked getting an early start on her chores. The earlier she began, the sooner she could be done, and the fewer run-ins she would have with the more aggressive pack members who were sometimes looking for an outlet for their frustration. She went about her tasks, collecting water from the river, scrubbing the cooking pots, hauling bundles of supplies to the main hall, and helping prepare the midday meal. The steady rhythm of work soothed her nerves, letting her mind wander free of anxiety. But that sense of calm only lasted until she was summoned by Beta Lucian later in the afternoon. When an Omega was summoned by a Beta, it was rarely a good thing. Wiping her hands on her worn apron, Ember quietly followed the pack messenger to one of the side buildings near the main house. It was a place used for smaller gatherings or private discussions. Her heart pounded in her chest like a trapped animal. She tried to keep her posture controlled, but the tension in her limbs betrayed her fear. Had she done something wrong? Was it about last night, when she drew the Alpha's attention, even momentarily? She cursed herself for being so careless. With a trembling breath, she stepped into the room. Beta Lucian stood near a broad wooden table, reviewing a stack of documents. He was tall, with a stern face, and carried a scent of disciplined authority. She kept her gaze lowered, as was expected. He glanced up at her with cool, dark eyes. "Ember," he said, his voice clipped. "I have a new assignment for you." She swallowed, bracing for a reprimand. Instead, Lucian raised an eyebrow, as if he were examining her. He sighed. "The Alpha has requested more assistance in the upper levels of the main house. I have chosen you to fulfill that role." Her eyes shot up in surprise, but she quickly lowered them again. Assistance in the upper levels of the main house? That was where the higher-ranked wolves lived and worked, including the Alpha's private quarters, meeting rooms, and offices. Omegas were not typically assigned up there unless they had proven themselves extremely trustworthy, or unless they were being watched carefully for some reason. Either possibility made her uneasy. Lucian continued, "You will be working under the supervision of Madame Giselle, the housekeeper. She will instruct you on your daily duties. You must be punctual, thorough, and discreet. If you fail in any of these aspects, you will be immediately dismissed, and I will see that you do not hold any further position of importance in this pack. Is that clear?" Ember nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, Beta," she answered softly. He dismissed her with a curt gesture. She left the building with her head spinning. This assignment was either an opportunity or a hidden trap, and she had no idea which. Regardless, she had no choice but to obey. By late afternoon, she presented herself at the main house. Madame Giselle was waiting, dressed in a simple but elegant gown, her posture upright and proper. She had silver streak hair pinned into a bun, and her eyes were the color of old oak bark, watchful and shrewd. "You must be Ember," Giselle said in a neutral tone. "Come, we have much to do." She led Ember through a maze of corridors, explaining the daily routines. The floors needed polishing, the windows needed wiping. Fresh linens had to be placed in every room, tea sets arranged for the visitors who often came to speak with the Alpha and his advisors. Ember listened carefully, determined not to make even a single mistake. She found herself in awe of the lavish furnishings, the art on the walls, the scent of polished wood and expensive incense in the air. The upper levels were so different from the cramped Omega quarters that the contrast made her dizzy. As she worked, she hoped she could go unnoticed, an invisible helper fulfilling tasks with quiet diligence. But that proved impossible whenever the Alpha or his chief advisors traversed the corridors. Her heart lurched every time she heard Killian's voice echo through the hall, deep and resonant. She would freeze, anxious to avoid drawing his attention, especially after that brief, charged moment of eye contact the previous night. But inevitably, her gaze would stray toward him, catching glimpses of his tall frame and the broad set of his shoulders as he consulted with his Beta and Gamma. She reminded herself not to linger on such details. It was dangerous to indulge in fascination toward the Alpha. He was so far above her in every way that even momentary admiration felt like stepping over a line. Still, a subtle part of her recognized that her wolf spirit, buried within, was reacting strongly to his presence. Too strongly. She tried to ignore it. It was just a meaningless quirk, she told herself. The Alpha's aura was strong. Anyone in the vicinity would be affected by it. By dusk, she was exhausted from the mental strain of being in such close proximity to the higher-ranked wolves. Her final task was to deliver fresh towels to a chamber near the Alpha's office. The corridor was quiet as she approached, carrying the folded towels against her chest. She was relieved that the day was nearly done. Her back ached, and her nerves were fried from constantly worrying that she might break an expensive ornament or walk in on a private conversation. Once she left the towels, she could slip away to her bunk, maybe catch a few hours of restless sleep, then do it all again tomorrow. But as she opened the door, she found the room already occupied. Standing by the window, staring down at some documents spread on a side table, was none other than Killian himself. His broad shoulders filled the space, and though he wore a simple, well-tailored shirt and trousers, his presence was anything but plain. Ember nearly dropped the towels in her shock. Instantly, she lowered her head, trying to back out of the room before he could notice. But her clumsy attempt to retreat made the door creak loudly, and he turned. "Ember," he said, his voice rolling across her senses. "Come in." Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would rattle her bones. She stepped forward, carefully shutting the door behind her. "Alpha," she managed, lowering her gaze to his boots. He studied her for a moment, and she felt that strange awareness again, as though he could peer through all her layers of guardedness. The silence stretched. Then he let out a low sigh and motioned to the table. "You can put the towels there," he said, his voice calm. She obeyed quickly, placing the towels in a neat stack. She then moved to step back, but he surprised her by speaking again. "Thank you for your hard work today," he said softly. Her head jerked up in surprise. Alphas did not typically thank Omegas. She wasn't even sure he was addressing her directly at first. Her confusion must have been plain on her face, because a slight smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. She swallowed. It's my duty, Alpha," she whispered, uncertain how to respond. He nodded. "Yes, it is," he murmured, his gaze sliding across her features. "But I appreciate diligence, and from what I hear, you've been quite helpful. You took on these new tasks with no complaint." Ember felt her cheeks warm. She couldn't decide if his scrutiny made her want to vanish or made her want to stand taller. She was not used to being praised, not by someone like him. She fumbled with the hem of her apron. "Thank you, Alpha," she managed, grateful that her voice didn't shake. He regarded her for a moment longer, his brows drawing together slightly, as if something puzzled him about her. Then he blinked and seemed to come to a decision. "You may go," he said, in a tone that indicated dismissal. She bowed her head again and all but fled the room, her pulse thrumming wildly. Embarrassment, excitement, and confusion warred inside her chest. She didn't look back, but she could practically feel his gaze on her until the door closed behind her. Over the next few days, Ember's new routine solidified. She reported to Madame Giselle, attended to the housekeeping tasks on the upper floors, and tried her best to remain out of sight whenever higher-ranked wolves were nearby. The Alpha was often behind closed doors in his private study, so she rarely encountered him directly. That helped calm her nerves. She found a sort of rhythm in the hustle of cleaning and preparing rooms, and she tried to ignore the faint but undeniable sensations that lingered in her mind whenever she passed the Alpha's door. But fate, in its twisted humor, refused to let things remain so simple. Late one afternoon, there was commotion in the main hall. Ember heard heated voices drifting from the corridor as she was polishing a wooden banister. She recognized Lucian's clipped tone and the softer lilt of Gamma Sibyl, but there was also another voice, deeper, laced with arrogance. A visiting alpha from another territory, perhaps. Curiosity stirred within her. She only ever saw outsiders from a distance. Maybe she could catch a brief glance of them if they came into the corridor. She busied herself with the banister, half listening as the voices grew louder. She caught snippets of conversation about territory lines, alliances, and tensions brewing in the outskirts of the region. Words like hostile takeover and defiance of established accords floated through the air. She had no context to put them in, but the tension was palpable. Abruptly, the voices stilled, as if an argument had ended in quiet fury. A heartbeat later, the door to the main hall slammed open. Ember froze in place, still holding her cloth and polish. She was just out of sight, but if someone stepped around the corner, they would see her. Through the swirling dust motes in the corridor, she glimpsed a tall figure stalking away, the faint echo of bitter frustration hanging in the air. Then, after a pause, she heard Lucian speaking softly to someone else, presumably the Alpha. The conversation was too hushed for Ember to discern the exact words. She caught only a few phrases like, "We can't let them," "He won't negotiate," and "the others will stand with us." Then there was the unmistakable growl of Killian's voice, low but insistent. The tone alone was enough to make her wolf stir inside. She stayed still, anxiously waiting for the corridor to clear. Finally, she heard the group disperse. Ember breathed a sigh of relief, returning to her polishing. She tried to remain inconspicuous, focusing on the simple task at hand, but a chill ran up her spine, a sense of something ominous closing in. She'd never been close to the pack's politics, but the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. These were not idle discussions. There was a real threat looming beyond the borders, and it seemed to be spurring conflict that could spill over into Silvercrest. That night, as she retreated to the Omega quarters, she overheard a pair of guards discussing rumors. Apparently, there were some packs that despised the way Killian led, seeing him as too lenient in certain areas and too unyielding in others. They wanted a more pliant or more ruthless alpha, someone who would bend to the old ways, or someone who would tear down the established order. Ember listened with mounting dread. Political turmoil often led to bloodshed, and bloodshed always found its way down to the most vulnerable ranks, including the Omegas. Ember's chest tightened at the realization. She made her way to her bunk, curling up under the thin blanket. She wanted to sleep, but her mind was whirling. She tried to quell the uneasy feeling that something was coming, something big that she could not escape. And all the while, the memory of Killian's intense gaze refused to leave her thoughts. The following weeks brought more of the same. Strangers came and went, some with demands, some with veiled threats. The tension in the main house was enough to make even the staff on edge. Ember did her best to adapt, working diligently, trying not to let the dark undercurrent of conflict seep into her bones. But it was difficult. She noticed that whenever she caught sight of the Alpha, he looked more burdened, more pensive. His interactions with the pack grew sharper, as though the stress was eroding his patience. She felt a pang of sympathy for him. It was dangerous to empathize with someone so far above her station, but she could not help it. She could feel the weight he bore, and it tugged at something within her. One stormy evening, everything changed. Rain battered the rooftops, lightning illuminating the sky with jagged forks of light. Ember was alone in a side hallway, cleaning a hearth. Most of the staff had left their duties early due to the storm, but she still had a few final tasks to complete. Thunder shook the glass in the windows. She shivered, trying to steady the brush in her hands. Suddenly, the door at the end of the corridor burst open, and Beta Lucien rushed in, flanked by a pair of guards. Their eyes were wild, and the guards were supporting a wounded man between them. Ember froze, adrenaline shooting through her veins. The man groaned, blood staining his tunic. Lucien barked an order to the guards, telling them to take him to the infirmary. Ember pressed herself against the wall, trying not to hinder them as they passed. Rainwater and the pungent smell of iron from the blood made her stomach churn. Before she could fully process what had happened, another figure entered behind them. Alpha Killian strode in, rain-soaked and furious. His eyes blazed like molten fire. He glanced at Ember for a moment, then fixed his attention on Lucien. "Any casualties?" he demanded. Lucien shook his head. "None, but we have a problem. That was a scout from the eastern border. He says rival wolves have been lurking, waiting for the right moment. They attacked him. Looks like a warning." Killian swore under his breath, the word a guttural sound. "Increase the patrols," he snapped, raking his hand through his wet hair. "I want watch points doubled, especially at the east." Lucien nodded, then rushed off to carry out his orders. Killian stood there for a moment, chest heaving. Ember dared not move. Then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, he looked at her. The candlelight flickered across his features, revealing the stormy swirl of emotions in his eyes: anger, fear, frustration, determination. "Ember," he said at last, and his voice was unsteady in a way she had never heard before. "Go to your quarters. Lock the doors. Do not venture out until you're given permission. This may not be safe anymore." She swallowed. "Alpha," she began, her voice trembling with alarm. She felt as though a cord inside her had been plucked, sending echoes of fear and urgency through her body. "Is the pack in danger?" He hesitated, his jaw tense. "We are, but I will not allow them to harm our people." The electricity in his gaze made her heart pound. "Go," he said again, "and stay safe." Ember bowed her head, then darted away, her thoughts spinning. The fear in the pack was almost palpable now, an undercurrent that wrapped around her like a cold wind. She reached the Omega quarters, quickly telling the others what she had witnessed, though she spared them the more gruesome details. Everyone began murmuring anxiously. Some paced the length of the small space, while others huddled together for comfort. No one wanted a conflict. Omegas always suffered when blood was spilled. In the days that followed, patrols were indeed increased, and the entire pack was on high alert. Ember's work in the main house continued, but the tension was suffocating. She found herself glimpsing Killian more often, though always at a distance, issuing commands, coordinating with Lucien, or returning at odd hours, his expression grim. Whenever she felt the weight of his gaze, her heart skipped a beat. She told herself it was fear, but a deeper truth stirred inside her that she refused to acknowledge. One morning, during a moment of reprieve, Ember found herself in the back gardens, gathering some fresh herbs at Madame Giselle's request. The sun was shining, a welcome break from the stormy weather that had plagued them recently. The garden stone pathway glistened from the morning dew, and the scent of rosemary and thyme hung in the warm air. Absorbed in her task, she nearly dropped her basket when she sensed someone behind her. Turning slowly, she saw Killian standing a few steps away. The bright sunlight caught in his dark hair, highlighting the angles of his face. A flicker of uncertainty passed through her. She quickly lowered her gaze. "You are collecting herbs for the house staff?" he asked, his voice gentler than usual. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Ember," he said quietly, "I am aware of how frightened many in our pack have become. I want you to know that I will protect them, protect you, with my life if necessary." Her eyes darted up involuntarily. She felt the intensity of his vow like a tangible force, and it made her wolf stir inside, uncertain but intrigued. Omegas rarely receive direct reassurances from the Alpha, and the sincerity in his voice set her pulse racing. She mustered the courage to speak. "Thank you, Alpha," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. We appreciate your protection." He nodded, a faint smile boasting across his lips. "We may be facing a challenge, but I will not allow harm to come to Silvercrest." She believed him. In that moment, his conviction was so raw and fierce that she did not doubt he would fight tooth and nail for his pack. Something in her chest constricted, an emotion she could not name. Before she could say more, he excused himself, leaving her standing in the garden with trembling hands. Ember tried to bury the lingering warmth his words had ignited in her. It was foolish to think it meant anything beyond simple reassurance. She was just an Omega, one he was duty-bound to protect, nothing more. Over the next few weeks, her life continued in the same pattern: chores, cleaning, quiet observation of the pack's growing anxiety. As the threats from beyond their borders escalated, the tension within Silvercrest rose. There were murmurs of traitors and saboteurs in the midst, though no one knew for certain if such rumors were true. Fear made suspicion run rampant. Still, even as unrest simmered, Ember felt a subtle shift whenever she was near Killian. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if his wolf recognized her presence, as if he could find her in a crowded hall without trying. She couldn't deny that her own wolf responded in kind. She fought to quell the strange sparks of awareness that flared in her chest, telling herself it was all in her imagination, that she was merely reacting to the powerful aura of an alpha. And yet, a quiet longing flickered inside her, a longing for something impossible. That impossibility became a thunderstorm of reality on the night of the harvest moon gathering. It was a traditional ceremony for Silvercrest, a time when the wolves feasted, danced under the moon, and reaffirmed their bonds as a pack. Given the recent threats, most were eager for a moment of celebration, hoping to strengthen pack unity. Of course, the event would also welcome a few invited guests from allied packs, turning it into a night of politics as well. Ember, along with other Omegas, had been tasked with preparing the grand hall for the festivities. They decorated with autumn foliage, hung lanterns along the balconies, and arranged chairs for the formal part of the evening. Everything had to be perfect. She could hardly contain her nerves. The harvest moon gathering was one of the most important events of the year, and for the first time, she would be present in the main house instead of kept away in the Omega quarters. Though she was only there in a serving capacity, she felt the weight of the night pressing on her. As dusk approached, the pack gathered. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and colorful vegetables. The sweet aroma of pies and fruit tarts mingled in the air. Musicians played lively tunes, their strings and drums echoing off the hall's high ceiling. Torches flickered, casting dancing shadows on the ornate walls. The entire pack wore their best attire, though for an Omega like Ember, that still meant a simple and modest dress in subdued colors. She felt a pang of longing as she saw the other she-wolves in shimmering fabrics, their hair styled beautifully. She tried to keep her head high as she circulated among the guests, refilling drinks and clearing plates. She couldn't help noticing that many of the female wolves, particularly those of higher rank, cast lingering glances at the alpha. This was normal, after all. Killian was an unmated alpha, a powerful and imposing presence. Many dreamed of wearing his mock and becoming his Luna. The swirl of silks and perfumes that drifted in his wake attested to how many vied for his attention. Ember watched from the sidelines, reminding herself she had no business feeling envious. An Omega could never be chosen as a mate, certainly not for an Alpha. It was unthinkable, impossible. The ceremony began with a blessing to the moon and to the ancestors, a moment where the entire pack bowed their heads in reverence. Then came speeches, toasts to unity and prosperity, and an official welcome to the guests from allied territories. Ember listened from the periphery, her heart lifting slightly at the notion of solidarity. Perhaps with strong alliances, Silvercrest could stand against the threats looming in the shadows. Once the formalities concluded, the music resumed. Wolves laughed, danced, and chatted. Ember was weaving through the crowd when a sudden hush fell over the hall. She turned to see Killian standing on a small dais at the front, gazing out over the gathered wolves. Lucian and Sybil flanked him, their expressions unreadable. The music faded, and all eyes fixed on the Alpha. Killian spoke, his voice resonating powerfully. "Tonight, we gather to celebrate the harvest moon, a time of abundance, of gratitude, and of unity. But we also face dangers beyond our borders, threats that would seek to divide us or harm our loved ones. I will do everything in my power to defend Silvercrest and ensure that we thrive despite the challenges. Ma." A ripple of murmured agreement spread through the crowd. Many nodded, admiration evident in their expressions. Killian let the silence linger for a moment, then continued. "In times of difficulty, a pack needs not only strength, but harmony. A leader must have not only power, but a mate who embodies loyalty and compassion. I have decided that the time has come for me to claim a mate. Our Luna." A collective gasp surged through the hall. Excitement, curiosity, and envy rippled among the she-wolves. Some exchanged eager glances. Others narrowed their eyes competitively. Whispers broke out in every corner. Ember's heart pounded so forcefully she thought she might faint. She was grateful no one was looking her way. Of course, it was inevitable that Killian would eventually choose a mate. An Alpha's mark would bring stability to the pack and strengthen alliances. But it was also known that such a choice typically followed from strategic relationships or politically beneficial matches. Many had speculated that he might align with the daughter of a neighboring Alpha, forging a powerful union. Ember's throat constricted painfully. For some reason, hearing him declare his intention struck her more deeply than she expected. She had to force herself to breathe. Killian raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "I know you have many questions," he said, "but I do not make such decisions lightly. While I value alliances and tradition, I will only claim the one chosen by my instincts and my wolf. I will only mark the one who resonates with my soul, who can stand by me through adversity." Ember almost dropped the empty tray she was carrying. The weight in his voice and the fierce light in his eyes took on a new dimension. She saw the confusion and longing in the crowd, but she also felt a strange, faint spark within her chest. She tried to stifle it, telling herself she was imagining things. Killian paused, and a muscle in his jaw flexed. Then, in a slow, purposeful motion, he lifted his gaze, scanning the crowd. Every she-wolf present straightened, hearts aflutter, waiting, hoping for his attention. Time seemed to slow as the room held its collective breath. But to everyone's shock, his gaze locked onto a distant corner, locked onto Ember. Her heart nearly stopped. She found herself pinned by his stare, her entire body going numb. This was not happening, could not be happening. She stood rooted to the spot, the tray in her hands suddenly feeling like an anchor. A new wave of hushed gasps rippled around her, as others noticed where the Alpha's eyes had settled. Confusion spread among the pack like wildfire. Why was Killian looking at the Omega? Ember tried to tear her gaze away, panic radiating through her. But she found herself unable to move. A primal force seemed to hold her in place. The tension became suffocating. Then Killian spoke in a voice that resonated through every corner of the hall, leaving no room for doubt. "Ember," he said, "come forward." She couldn't disobey. With trembling steps, she placed the tray on a nearby table and wove through the crowd, which parted for her like a wave. Disbelief etched itself into the faces of those watching. Many had expressions of shock. Others scowled or whispered. A hush fell, broken only by the pounding of Ember's pulse in her ears. She reached the dais. The Omega and the Alpha stood face to face, separated by a mere breath of space. She kept her head bowed, eyes on the polished floor, heart hammering. Killian moved closer, gently tilting her chin up until her eyes met his. The raw intensity in his gaze sent a tremor through her entire body. "By the will of my wolf," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "and by the instincts that guide me, I claim you, Ember, as my mate." A collective uproar rippled through the gathering. Shock, protest, and awe rose in a cacophony of voices. No one could believe it. An Omega, chosen by the Alpha? It was beyond unprecedented. It defied every law and custom. Ember felt her mind spinning, her heart torn between terror and a strange, blazing joy. She wanted to deny it, to protest that it was impossible, yet deep inside her wolf roared with an unmistakable longing. Killian drew her close, his breath warm against her ear. "I can feel you, Ember," he murmured, so softly that no one else could hear. "You and I, we are meant to be, no matter how the world judges us." Before she could speak, he bared his teeth and, with a decisive motion, sank them into the juncture of her neck and shoulder. Pain and ecstasy exploded through her veins as the mark sizzled into place. Her vision blurred, and the entire hall erupted in chaos. Some gasped in horror, others howled their approval, and still others cried out in alarm. But in that white-hot moment, all Ember could feel was the searing bond forming between them, tethering their wolves together. She stumbled, but Killian's arm wrapped around her waist, holding her up. Her senses were flooded by his scent, his power, his fierce protectiveness. In the roaring sea of madness, she knew one thing for certain. No matter what trials awaited them, she could no longer hide in the shadows. Killian had broken every law and every tradition, and now she bore the Alpha's mark before the entire pack. The bonfire crackled in the center of the courtyard, its flames a stark counterpoint to the stunned silence that had settled over the crowd. The harvest moon hung full and brilliant overhead, illuminating the ring of shocked faces surrounding Killian and Ember. 100 eyes were focused on the crimson droplets of blood staining Ember's shoulder, on the fresh mark that now signified she was the Alpha's mate. In that moment, time felt suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Then everything happened at once. A chorus of shocked voices erupted around the clearing. Some cried out in protest, others demanded explanations, and more still simply stared in bewilderment. The pack was torn between reverence for their alpha's decision and the instinctive recoil of seeing an omega claimed. Several of the higher-ranked she-wolves, those who had harbored hopes of being chosen, looked on with betrayal etched into their expressions. Others just gaped, as if the world had been turned upside down. Killian's grip on Ember's waist never loosened. She clung to him, still dizzy from the influx of sensations. She had never experienced anything like the bond that now pulsed through her veins. It was like stepping into a realm where every color was more vivid, every sound more resonant. She felt his heartbeat merging with her own, a powerful thrum that stirred her wolf spirit, so long suppressed. "Enough!" Killian's voice rang out over the noise. He turned in a slow circle, eyes glowing with the power of the alpha. "This is my choice. My wolf recognized her, and so have I. I will have no arguments." Silence fell, uneasy and tense. Lucian stood a few paces away, his expression carefully neutral. Sybil, the Gamma, cast worried glances at several angry-looking pack members who were huddled together, whispering furiously. Ember could see the flash of their eyes, sense the hostility radiating from them, but no one dared speak outright against the alpha, at least not yet. Her shoulder throbbed where Killian's teeth had broken the skin. A faint trickle of blood still stained the neckline of her simple dress. The pain was oddly intoxicating, intertwined with a sense of belonging she had never known. She hardly had a chance to process it before Killian turned, gently guiding her toward the wooden platform at the front of the courtyard. The hush followed them, as if the entire pack collectively held its breath. Lucian and Sybil stepped forward. Even they looked somewhat rattled, though they strove to project calm. Lucian cleared his throat. "Long live the Alpha," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. Then, taking Ember by surprise, he added, "Long live the Luna." That was the formal call, the acknowledgement of the Alpha's mate. It was tradition for the pack to respond with a roar of approval, but the reaction was uncertain. Some voices joined in, albeit hesitantly, while others remained silent, as if refusing to participate. Ember felt their stares like daggers on her skin. She couldn't blame them. She was an Omega, and no Omega had ever stood on this dais as Luna. Still, Killian's arm around her waist offered a measure of protection. He drew her close, his gaze sweeping across the crowd with a silent challenge. Finally, after a long and charged moment, he spoke again. "This celebration is over for tonight," he declared firmly. "We'll reconvene tomorrow to discuss the path forward. For now, I expect every one of you to respect my decision." He led Ember away, leaving the stunned pack to disperse in uneasy clusters. She was dimly aware of the hush that followed them, the hush that only broke into hushed murmurs once they were out of earshot. Ember's mind was still spinning. She kept her eyes fixed on the stone pathway beneath her feet, struggling to quell the tremors in her limbs. Part of her wanted to turn and run, to disappear into the night, and pretend this had never happened. Yet the new bond in her blood anchored her to Killian with unbreakable force. He guided her into the main house, moving swiftly through the corridors until they reached a room Ember had never entered before. A spacious lounge with dark wooden walls and an unlit fireplace. It looked private, the kind of place where the Alpha might discuss sensitive matters with his most trusted advisors. The door closed behind them with a decisive click. For a long moment, neither spoke. Ember could hardly force herself to lift her gaze from the floor. She was acutely aware of the heat radiating from Killian's body. of the mark throbbing against her shoulder. At last he placed a gentle hand under her chin, lifting her head until her eyes met his. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his tone quiet but laced with concern. She swallowed. "No more than expected," she whispered, pressing a trembling hand against the mark. "But Alpha IAE..." She didn't even know what she wanted to say. How could she put into words the whirlwind of confusion and emotion consuming her? Killian's expression softened. "I know this is overwhelming," he said. "But it was the only way." She frowned, questions exploding in her mind. "The only way for what? Why did you choose me? I'm just an Omega." His eyes darkened with an emotion she couldn't name. "You're not just anything, Ember. My wolf recognized you the moment I first saw you stumble in the clearing. You were so shy, so determined to fade into the background, but I couldn't ignore it. Something inside me stirred, something I've never felt before." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I tried to deny it, believe me. I know what the pack expects. I know the traditions, the politics. But I couldn't change what my wolf was telling me, what my instincts confirmed every time our paths crossed." Ember listened, her heart thundering. She recalled the odd moments when she sensed his presence, the goosebumps that rose on her skin whenever he was near. "But I don't understand." "Why would your wolf choose me?" She was not strong, not powerful. She had no influential connections. She was the one that even other Omegas overlooked. Killian's hand found hers, threading their fingers together. She stiffened at the unexpected touch. The storm in his gaze churned with sincerity. "I don't have a logical answer. The bond between mates isn't always logical. But I feel it, here." He brought her hand to rest against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beak beneath her palm. "And you feel it too," he added quietly, "or else you wouldn't have accepted the mark." A tremor coursed through her. She remembered that instant under the moonlight, the undeniable rightness that had swept over her despite the shock. Her wolf had awakened fully, responding to his claim. It was more than lust or admiration. It was instinct, soul-deep and primal. She lowered her gaze, tears stinging the back of her eyes. "I'm afraid," she admitted softly. "Afraid of what the others will do or say. They'll never accept me as Luna. You broke every tradition." His grip on her hand tightened. "I won't lie to you. Some in the pack will fight this, especially those who had their own ambitions. But I am the Alpha, and my word is law. Anyone who tries to harm you will face my wrath." A low growl underlined his words, bristling with protective fury. Ember shivered, torn between relief and anxiety. She had never had anyone stand up for her so fiercely, but she also knew the pack's resentment could grow dangerously. "I don't want you to be at war with your own people," she said. Killian exhaled slowly, releasing her hand. "If it comes to that, I'll do whatever is necessary to keep you safe." Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of an uncertain future. Ember's mind raced, imagining the possible outcomes, the hostility she was sure to face. But a flicker of warmth in her chest refused to be extinguished. He had chosen her, unthinkable as it seemed. Some part of her was irrevocably drawn to him, tethered by a bond she could neither explain nor deny. At length, she took a shaky breath. "What happens now?" Killian studied her, a hint of uncertainty lurking behind his confident facade. "Now, we have to navigate the consequences of our bond. We'll have a formal recognition of you as Luna in front of the entire pack. But first, we should let tensions settle. address any immediate threats from the outside, and show everyone that you are worthy of your new title. She winced. Worthy? I'm not sure how I can prove that. He raised her chin again, his touch gentle. I see your heart, Ember. You have more strength than you realize. You've endured so much as an Omega, being overlooked, belittled, taken for granted, yet you never lost your kindness. If that isn't worthiness, I don't know what is. Emotion choked her, and she blinked back tears. No one had ever spoken such words to her. I'll try my best, she whispered. He offered a faint smile, brushing a tear from her cheek. That's all I ask. Then he stepped away, as if wary of overwhelming her further. It's late, and you need rest. Can you walk back to your quarters? Ember hesitated. Would she still be allowed to stay in the Omega quarters now that she was his mate? The prospect filled her with mingled relief and dread. But she wasn't ready to move into a higher-ranked space. Not yet. Yes, I can, she said, voice trembling slightly. But what if... She trailed off, thinking of the hostile stares, the angry whispering. Would it even be safe for her? Killian seemed to read her apprehension. I'll assign a guard to escort you tonight, he said firmly. And tomorrow we'll discuss new arrangements. She nodded, feeling both reassured and uneasy about having a guard. This was happening too fast. Her entire life had changed in a single night, and she didn't know how to anchor herself amid the chaos. When she stepped into the corridor, Sybil was waiting, looking tense. She gave Ember a fleeting smile, then accompanied her outside, where a stoic guard took position at Ember's side. They walked through the chilly night air, the moon still blazing overhead, though now hidden behind drifting clouds. The embers of the broken feast smoldered in the distance, sending up tendrils of smoke. Ember wrapped her arms around herself, keenly aware of the fresh wound on her shoulder. The guard flanked her closely, watching for any signs of threat. She could sense Sybil's curiosity, but the Gamma asked no questions, only casting concerned glances in Ember's direction. They parted ways near the Omega quarters, and Ember slipped inside, bracing for the reactions of her fellow Omegas. Predictably, the room fell silent the moment she entered. Everyone's eyes locked on her. Normally, Omegas greeted each other with mild indifference or casual nods, but this time she felt a storm of conflicting emotions swirling around her. Some looked at her with open hostility, others with nervousness, and a few with awe. A hush fell, so complete that Ember could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She tried to keep her voice steady as she said, "Good evening." Then she hurried to her bunk, conscious that all eyes tracked her every movement. She sat down on the edge of the pallet, her mind still reeling. A young Omega girl named Ray finally broke the silence, stepping closer with wide eyes. She glanced at the guard who stood just outside the door, clearly perplexed, then spoke in a hushed tone. "Is it true? Did the Alpha choose you?" Ember exhaled shakily. Yes. Shock rippled through the small gathering. Some exchanged glances, unsure how to react. A braver Omega, a muscular youth named Garrick, spoke up with a hint of bitterness. "So we're still stuck down here while you get to go upstairs. Is that it?" Ember winced. She didn't want them to resent her, but she also didn't have an explanation for them. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said, voice trembling with sincerity. "All I know is that he claimed me in front of everyone. It wasn't something we planned. I'm still processing it myself." A heavy silence followed. Some turned away, muttering under their breath. Others simply stared at Ember as if she had grown a second head. She felt tears prick her eyes again, but she refused to let them fall in front of them. She just wanted some quiet, some chance to breathe. At last she lay down on her bunk, curling up under the thin blanket. The mark on her shoulder burned hot, reminding her of Killian's bite and the bond that now bound them together. She closed her eyes, exhaustion tugging at her. Thoughts spun in her mind, the stunned reaction of the pack, the uncertain future, the hostility radiating from some corners. But beneath it all, an unfamiliar warmth pulsed in her blood, reassuring her that she was not alone, that her mate was out there somewhere, sharing this bond. Eventually, she drifted into a restless sleep. When dawn broke, the Omega quarters stirred to life. Ember rose quietly, her emotions tangled in knots. She could feel curious eyes on her, but no one approached. The guard still waited outside, nodding to her as she stepped beyond the threshold. She braced herself, unsure if the entire pack would try to confront her, or if they would avoid her in confusion. The morning air was crisp, and the sky was streaked with pale lavender light. Ember inhaled slowly, trying to calm herself. She had to get to the main house. Surely Killian would want to address the pack about last night's events. Her stomach twisted at the thought of standing beside him before the entire crowd. But there was no going back. She walked the familiar path, the guard trailing behind her. As she passed groups of pack members, some fell silent. Others openly stared. She felt their confusion, their disbelief, even their disgust. Her cheeks burned under the weight of their scrutiny. But what stunned the most was spotting a small knot of wolves who glared at her with open hate. She recognized them as those who held strong prejudices against Omegas, or who had ties to certain higher-ranked she-wolves who had hoped for the Alpha's favor. Whispers of outrageous, "She's not worthy, and she'll ruin us," drifted in the air. She tried to keep her composure as she reached the doors of the main house. Madame Giselle, looking unusually flustered, opened the door and led her inside. "Alpha has asked that you wait in the sitting room," the housekeeper said, her normally brisk tone softened by sympathy. "He will be with you shortly." Ember mumbled her thanks, stepping into the opulent sitting room with velvet drapes and polished marble floors. Her hands trembled as she sank into a chair, conscious that the guard remained stationed by the door. The house was oddly quiet. Usually it bustled with staff, but today it seemed most had retreated or were keeping to the shadows. At last the door swung open, and Killian entered, flanked by Lucian and Sybil. Ember rose from her seat, heart pounding. She took in the sight of the Alpha's tense expression, the Beta's neutral reserve, and the Gamma's worried frown. "Ember," Killian said, his voice a low rumble. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." She sank back down, and he took the chair opposite hers, resting his elbows on his thighs. "We need to address the pack today," he said. "There are many who are uncertain, or worse, furious, about my choice. But you are my mate, and I will stand by that." Her gaze flicked between him and Lucian. The Beta's face was difficult to read, but she sensed he was not altogether comfortable with this situation, even if he would never openly defy his Alpha. Sybil looked more openly concerned, but not hostile. "Alpha," Ember said in a shaky voice, "I don't want to cause discord in the pack." "You're not causing discord," he countered firmly. "My decision might have stirred it up, but the seeds of discontent were already there. If anyone challenges you, they challenge me." Lucian cleared his throat. "We should make a formal announcement confirming Ember's position as your mate. We can do it this afternoon, so rumors don't spiral further." Sybil nodded. "We can gather the pack in the courtyard. But be prepared, Alpha. Some might refuse to attend, and others could be openly defiant." Killian's jaw tightened. "Then they will learn that defiance has consequences. Ember's stomach churned. She didn't want to spark violence. But she also understood that, in the world of wolves, authority was not a suggestion, it was law, enforced by tooth and claw if necessary. Killian turned back to her. After the announcement, I'll arrange for you to move out of the Omega quarters. You'll have a private room here. She hesitated, dread twisting in her chest. I'm not sure if I'm ready for that. He exhaled, leaning closer. It's not safe for you to remain with the Omegas. Some might blame you for rising above them. Others could be ordered to harm you by those who oppose our bond. I have to protect you. Protect. That word again. Ember realized that from the moment he marked her, she had become the center of a storm. As terrifying as that was, she also felt a flicker of gratitude. No one had ever wanted to shield her before. Lucian shifted his weight, drawing her attention. We should also discuss the external threats, Alpha. Our patrols encountered suspicious movements near the north border last night. There may be hostile packs trying to exploit the turmoil they've heard about here. Killian's eyes gleamed with worry. I won't let them use our internal conflict against us. That's another reason we must show unity behind my choice. He paused, then fixed Ember with a solemn stare. Are you prepared to stand beside me? She sucked in a breath. Was she prepared? Could she ever truly be ready for this? Her mind flashed with the memory of his bite under the moon, the undeniable bond coursing through her veins. Despite her fear, she nodded. Yes, she said softly. I'll stand beside you. A ghost of a smile curved his lips. Then let's go. They rose and stepped out into the corridor. The guard followed, along with Lucian and Sybil, as they made their way to the courtyard. Word had spread quickly, it seemed, because a large gathering of wolves already filled the open space. Conversations hushed as Killian strode to the front, Ember at his side. She felt as if her heart might burst from her chest. The weight of hundreds of eyes pinned her in place, many of them hostile, some merely uncertain. She caught glimpses of anger, disgust, pity, and the faintest sparks of curiosity. Trying to steady her breathing, she gazed at Killian for strength. He lifted a hand to command silence, and the crowd quieted, though tension still crackled in the air. Last night, he began, voice carrying across the courtyard. I claimed Ember as my mate under the harvest moon. I stand by that decision without regret. A murmur ran through the crowd. He continued, I know this breaks tradition, that some of you have doubts, but I will not allow my choice to be challenged. I am Alpha, and Ember is now your Luna. A handful of scattered voices erupted in response, some shouting outright protests, others grumbling. Killian's eyes flashed as he shot them a warning glare. Emboldened by their Alpha's presence, Ember raised her chin. She could feel the bond pulsing in her blood like a steady drumbeat, lending her courage she never had before. One wolf stepped forward, a tall, dark-haired female named Marissa. Ember recognized her as one of the higher-ranked she-wolves who had coveted the position of Luna. Her lip curled in a sneer. We can't just accept an Omega as our Luna. It's an insult to the entire pack's tradition. What makes her worthy of this honor? Killian growled, the sound reverberating through the clearing. But before he could speak, Ember found herself stepping forward. Her wolf stirred, urging her not to hide behind the Alpha's protection this time. It was terrifying to face the scorn of someone so much more powerful in rank, but a quiet resolution stiffened her spine. I'm not asking you to bow to me personally, she said in a clear, shaking voice. I'm asking you to trust your Alpha's decision. The bond is real, Anyone who felt it at the claiming knows that much. A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd at her speaking up. Marissa narrowed her eyes, clearly not expecting Ember to show backbone. The bond might be real, but that doesn't mean you're fit to lead. You've never had any responsibility beyond menial tasks. How will you guide us in times of crisis? Ember's pulse hammered in her ears. She remembered nights spent scrubbing floors, washing dishes, running errands without complaint. She recalled how her spirit refused to break despite the isolation and dismissiveness she endured. Sometimes the strength to endure is also strength to lead, she said quietly, mustering every ounce of courage. Marissa's eyes flashed, but she seemed at a loss for a retort. Before she could attempt one, Killian stepped in, the authority in his posture unmistakable. Enough, he growled. Ember has my trust. If any of you doubt my decision, challenge me directly. But be warned, you won't succeed. Silence followed, thick with tension. No one moved to challenge the Alpha outright. Even Marissa took a step back, lips pressed into a thin line. Defying the Alpha in a public fight was almost unthinkable, unless one had a sure path to victory, which she obviously did not. Some of the wolves in the crowd exchanged glances, uncertain how to proceed. At that moment, Beta Lucien stepped forward. In times of upheaval, we must show unity, he said, his voice calm but firm. Whatever your personal feelings, remember that Silvercrest's strength depends on standing behind the Alpha's choice. If any are found conspiring against our Luna, they'll answer to the Alpha's justice. Sybil nodded in agreement, adding, We have external threats watching for any sign of weakness. Dividing ourselves over this choice only helps our enemies. A murmur spread among the pack. Some nodded grudgingly. Others still looked uncertain, but the open hostility wavered, tempered by fear of retribution or the possibility of outside danger. Killian allowed the moment to linger, letting his words sink in. Then he said, Ember will move to a private chamber in the main house for her own safety. Treat her with the respect due to the Luna. That is my decree. And with that, the gathering began to dissolve. Wolves broke into smaller groups, talking in hushed tones. Many cast lingering, wary glances at Ember as they departed. She released a shaky breath, not even realizing she had been holding it. The guard came forward to escort her. The Killian took her arm, guiding her personally toward the main house. His touch was steady, radiating warmth through her tense muscles. Lucien fell in step behind them, apparently waiting for Killian's next orders. Once they were inside the main house and away from prying eyes, the Alpha turned to Ember. You spoke well, he said softly. You showed them that you're not a pushover. She managed a faint smile. I was terrified, she admitted. But I couldn't just stand there while they questioned you for choosing me. A flicker of approval lit Killian's eyes. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, a surprisingly gentle gesture considering the tumult of the morning. You don't have to do all this alone, he murmured. Remember, the bond goes both ways. Warmth spread through her chest. She nodded, feeling a spark of gratitude. Yet she couldn't ignore the anxious knot in her stomach, the knowledge that many in the pack still harbored resentment or confusion. It would take much more than a single public decree to quell their doubts. Killian led her through the corridors, up a wide staircase, until they reached a door at the end of a richly decorated hallway. He pushed it open, revealing a spacious room with a large bed, a sturdy wooden dresser, and tall windows overlooking the courtyard. It was far more luxurious than anything Ember had ever known. The sunlight streamed in through the curtains, illuminating the polished floor. This will be your room, he said, guiding her inside. You can decorate it as you like. If you need anything, let me know or ask Giselle. I'll ensure guards patrol outside, especially at night." She stood there, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances. Just yesterday, she was sleeping in the cramped Omega quarters on a narrow pallet. Now she had a bed that looked softer than a cloud, in a chamber that rivaled the highest-ranked wolves. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. Killian lingered at the threshold. "I have to meet with Lucian and Sybil to discuss the border issues," he said. "You should rest, maybe bathe and change. There are spare clothes in the dresser. We'll talk more this evening." Ember nodded, unable to find her voice. Then he was gone, closing the door gently behind him. She stood in the hush, staring at the thick rug underfoot, the ornate carvings on the furniture, the soft glow of sunlight through the window. It felt surreal, like waking up in someone else's life. Her shoulder still ached from the mark, a reminder that this wasn't a dream. Cautiously, she approached the mirror against one wall, eyeing her reflection. She looked much the same as ever. Slight frame, hair a bit tangled from the day's stress, eyes wide with uncertainty. But the bite mark was there, a faint bruise now, tinged with healing scars, where Killian's canines had pierced her skin. Tentatively, she traced a fingertip over it, feeling a shock of warmth radiate through her veins. The claim was undeniable, as was the bond that pulsed beneath the surface of her consciousness. Could she truly be the Luna? The notion both thrilled and terrified her. In the pack's lore, the Luna was the Alpha's partner, the one who nurtured and safeguarded the pack alongside him. She was to be respected, even revered. The idea of any Omega receiving such deference had once been unthinkable. Yet here she was. Suddenly, she was seized by a wave of dizziness. Perhaps it was the stress, the shock, or the swirling energy of the new bond. She sank onto the bed, pressing a hand to her forehead. The last thing she wanted was to faint. As the dizziness passed, she forced herself to take several slow breaths. She needed to adapt, fast. There were dangerous wolves in Silvercrest who would refuse to see her as Luna, and even more dangerous threats beyond the borders ready to exploit any weakness. If she crumbled now, she would undermine Killian's decision, and he would be forced to defend her at every turn, possibly at the cost of the entire pack's stability. Steeling herself, she walked to the dresser and opened it. Several neatly folded dresses lay inside, far finer than anything she had ever worn. She selected a simple one in a dark hue, not wanting to stand out more than she already did. Then she found the small adjoining washroom, with a porcelain basin and pitcher of water. She poured water into the basin, washing away the grime and tension that clung to her. The cool water against her heated skin was a balm to her frazzled nerves. Dressed in the new attire, she felt somewhat more composed as she returned to the bedroom. She opened a window to let in fresh air, leaning against the sill as she gazed out over the courtyard. From this vantage point, she could see wolves bustling about their daily tasks, some engaged in sparring drills, likely preparing for the threat of confrontation at the borders, while others carried supplies or tended to chores. A pang of homesickness struck her for the Omega quarters. They might have been cramped and unremarkable, but they were familiar. She understood her role there, understood the dynamic. Now she was in a lofty chamber with a big bed and thick carpets, and it felt alien. She couldn't help but question if she really belonged. Her thoughts spiraled, returning to the memory of Killian's bite under the moonlight, the swirl of power and desire that had consumed her in that moment. Could fate truly have chosen her, an Omega, to stand beside him as mate, and Luna? Instinct told her yes. The bond coursing through her blood told her yes. but the rational part of her mind was besieged by doubts. An abrupt knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. She turned to see Madame Giselle stepping inside, carrying a tray with a teapot and cups. The housekeeper's face was carefully composed, neither friendly nor hostile. She set the tray down on a small table by the window. "Alpha asked me to bring you some tea," Giselle said. "For your nerves, presumably." Ember forced a small smile. "Thank you." Giselle studied her. "I know you must be overwhelmed," she said softly, folding her hands in front of her apron. "I've served this pack for many years, and I've seen leadership changes before, but never like this. You will have to be strong, my dear." Ember swallowed, grateful for the hint of kindness in Giselle's words. "I'll do my best." The older woman nodded, pouring the tea. "Drink," she said, pushing a cup toward Ember. "It will help calm you." Ember obliged, taking a careful sip. The fragrant herbal brew slid down her throat, warm and soothing. She closed her eyes, letting the heat settle in her stomach. For a moment, she felt almost human again, almost at peace. "Thank you," she repeated. Giselle bobbed her head in acknowledgement. "I'll be outside if you need anything," she said, then retreated with a faint rustle of skirts. Ember found herself alone once more, the silence pressing in. She finished the tea, letting its warmth chase away the last edges of chill in her bones. Despite her lingering anxiety, she felt marginally more grounded. Time drifted as she sat there, watching the courtyard, her thoughts meandering between fear of the future and a deep-seated yearning for acceptance. She had no idea how long she remained in that quiet state before the door opened again, this time revealing Killian. He stepped inside, and she stood to greet him, noting the fatigue lining his face. "How are you feeling?" he asked, voice low. She hesitated, searching for a truthful answer that wasn't too dramatic. "Uncertain," she said at last, "but calmer." He studied her, then nodded. "Good. There's something we need to discuss." Her stomach twisted. "More announcements?" He shook his head. "No. It's about your safety. Some members of the pack clearly resent this union, and I've gotten wind of whispers about potential trouble. I can't be everywhere at once, so I want you to be cautious. Don't wander the halls alone at night. If you need to go somewhere, let a guard accompany you." The mention of trouble sent a chill racing down her spine. She recalled the venom in Marissa's eyes, the cluster of wolves who whispered among themselves, refusing to chant her name at the public gathering. "You think they might hurt me?" His lips thinned in anger. "I won't allow it, but I won't pretend it's impossible. There's already tension brewing on the borders. A single spark inside the pack could ignite a bigger conflict. My enemies, both within and without, would be thrilled to see this bond fail. It would undermine me. They might target you just to provoke a reaction." Ember swallowed hard, trying to keep her fear in check. "I understand," she said. "I'll be careful." Killian nodded, relief softening his expression. "Thank you. I'll feel better knowing you're guarded." He paused, then gently took her hand. The warmth of his skin made her pulse flutter. "I also wanted to check on the mark. Does it hurt?" She grimaced slightly. "A bit tender, but it's healing." He brushed her hair aside, carefully examining the faint bruise. She tensed at the intimacy of his touch, but she didn't pull away. There was something comforting in his closeness. She could feel the subtle tremor of possessiveness in him, a wolfish protectiveness that radiated through the bond. "It looks good," he said, stepping back. It will fade over time, leaving the scar. But the bond is for life. I want you to know, Ember, that I won't abandon you, no matter how many challenges we face. Emotion constricted her throat. She believed him. Somehow, she knew that if the world turned against them, Killian would stand by her. I appreciate that, she managed, swallowing. I'm not used to having anyone fight for me. He gave her a somber half-smile. That changes now. Rest. Try not to worry too much. She nodded, watching him leave with conflicting emotions churning in her chest. She felt a surge of gratitude for his concern, an echo of the bond that pulsed through her, but also a deep undercurrent of fear for what lay ahead. Even if he was willing to kill to protect her, that didn't guarantee her safety from the darkness lurking in the hearts of those who despised her claim to the Luna title. As the evening sky darkened outside her window, Ember's mind drifted to the danger that might be waiting just beyond the walls, as well as the enemies hidden in plain sight within them. She was the Luna now, bearing the Alpha's mark, but with that mark came a spotlight she had never asked for, and the knowledge that some wolves would kill to ensure an Omega never rose to power. She gazed out at the crescent moon rising in the distance. A storm of uncertainty lay before her, but one thing was clear: her life would never again be lived in the shadows. Ember woke the next morning in her new chamber, disoriented and still caught in the frayed threads of uneasy dreams. Rays of early sunlight streamed through the tall windows, gilding the polished floors in gold and creating a tapestry of dancing shadows on the walls. For several heartbeats, she forgot where she was. Then she glanced down at the luxurious bedspread, at the unfamiliar furniture, and finally at the faint bite scar on her shoulder, now more pink than raw. All of it reminded her that her life had irrevocably changed. She pressed a hand to the mark, letting the slow pulse of her own heartbeat under her fingertips ground her. Immediately, she felt that quiet but unmistakable hum of energy that meant the Alpha bond was awake inside her, as though connecting her to Killian, wherever he was in the estate. The sensation was comforting in a primal way, but it also magnified the weight of responsibility now resting on her. As she rose and dressed, she caught her reflection in a mirror. She had chosen another simple dress from the dresser, mindful that she did not want to draw unnecessary attention by adorning herself in lavish garments, even if some had been provided. Ember was an Omega, by upbringing and temperament. She had been content to slip in and out of sight for most of her life, but now everyone's eyes were fixed on her, measuring her worthiness. She could practically feel their judgment each time she stepped into view. Pushing down the knot of anxiety in her stomach, she made her way through the corridor. The palace-like architecture of the main house no longer seemed as overwhelmingly grand as it had the day before, but every so often she would glance at an ornate tapestry or a glittering chandelier and remember that she had once scrubbed floors and polished windows in these very halls, never imagining she would walk them as the Alpha's mate. A guard trailed her at a discreet distance. She still wasn't used to having a protector, and it made her feel oddly self-conscious, but after overhearing the whispered threats and seeing the hostile stares, she was grateful for the watchful presence. She found Madame Giselle busy in the main dining area, instructing the staff on breakfast arrangements. The hush that fell when Ember entered the space was palpable. Gazes flicked toward her, then away, not quite sure how to treat her. Previously, she would have been waved off to the kitchens or told to handle some menial task, but now the staff hesitated, uncertain if they were still above her in authority or if they should bow in respect. Clearing her throat, Ember offered a polite nod to Giselle. "Good morning," she said softly, forcing her voice not to quaver. "Is the Alpha here yet?" Giselle dipped her head in acknowledgement. "Good morning. He's in the conference chamber with Beta Lucian and Gamma Sybil," she replied, her tone carefully formal. "They're reviewing last night's border reports." Ember's pulse gave a nervous flutter. She had not yet attended any formal meetings regarding pack security, but now that she was Luna, surely she needed to be more informed. Hesitantly, she inched closer. "Do you think should I go to him?" she asked Giselle, unsure of the etiquette. The housekeeper's mouth tightened in thought. "That is your right as Luna, of course," she said slowly. "But if you're uncertain, perhaps you might wait for him to call you. The security briefings can be intense." Ember thought of the Alpha's vow that she should not remain ignorant of the threats to their land. She swallowed. "I would like to at least know if there's anything I can do," she said, though she doubted she would have a role in military strategy. Giselle nodded and motioned to a smaller side corridor that led toward the Alpha's private conference room. "Then go, child. Show them you aren't going to hide away in your new quarters." With a murmured thanks, Ember followed the hallway, the guard trailing behind. Her heart hammered louder with every step, but she refused to let nerves drive her back. She reached a large wooden door guarded by 2 sentinels. At her approach, they glanced at each other with uncertainty. Neither had been briefed on the protocol for the new Luna. Still, after a moment, one of the guards knocked on the door and announced her presence. "Your maid is here, Alpha." A brief silence ensued, then Killian's deep voice carried through the thick wood. "Let her in." When Ember stepped into the room, she was greeted by a table strewn with parchment maps, scattered documents, and the faint smell of ink. Killian stood at one end, leaning over the table with his hands braced on the edges, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. Lucian and Sybil were on either side, both wearing grim expressions. Their conversation halted at Ember's entrance, and 3 pairs of eyes snapped to her in varying degrees of surprise. "Ember," Killian said, straightening. "Is everything all right?" She fought the urge to bow her head and scurry away, reminding herself that she had a new station. "I'm fine," she answered, clasping her hands in front of her. "I just wanted to see if there's anything I can do, or if I should be aware of what's happening with the borders." The Beta and Gamma exchanged a glance. Lucian inclined his head politely, though Ember could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Alpha, we were just reviewing the morning's reports. There's been more activity near the eastern perimeter. Scouts have caught glimpses of foreign wolves crossing boundaries." Sybil folded her arms. "No direct attacks, but it looks like they're testing our defenses, seeing if we'll chase them off. We suspect the group might be allied with one of the rival Alphas who visited recently." Killian exhaled a sharp breath, raking a hand through his dark hair. "So they're probing us, looking for weak points." "Yes," Lucian agreed, then hesitated. "Alpha, do you want to continue this briefing in private?" His gaze flickered to Ember, and though he kept his tone respectful, his meaning was clear. Ember braced herself, waiting to see if Killian would dismiss her. But the Alpha's jaw tightened. "No," he said firmly. "She should stay." He shifted to face her. "Ember, you're Luna now. That means what affects the pack concerns you too. I want you to know the risks we face. Right now, it seems we have a group of wolves, possibly from a neighboring pack, testing the edges of our territory. We don't know if they plan to invade outright, or if they're hoping to incite conflict within Silvercrest. Either way, we have to be vigilant." Ember nodded, absorbing his words. She could sense the tension in the air, like a coiled spring. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, feeling a bit foolish, yet compelled to ask. Lucian and Sybil exchanged another look, clearly skeptical that an Omega-turned Luna could contribute to territorial strategy. But Killian's expression softened. "Right now, the best help you can offer is to maintain calm among the pack. Tensions are high. If you can quell some of the unrest and reassure those who might fear for their safety, it would be invaluable. We don't need panic compounding our external threats." She understood. "I'll try," she said. It was no small task, winning over a pack that mostly resented her presence. But if she could speak to them, show them she cared about their well-being, perhaps it would soothe some of their anger. Sybil stepped closer, pointing to a section of the map. "We've deployed additional patrols here and here," she explained, indicating 2 strategic points. "If these intruders make a direct move, we'll be ready. But it's the subtle infiltration attempts that concern us. With all the hostility surrounding Ember's new position, they could have spies inside our borders, waiting for a chance to spark chaos." Killian's features hardened. "We'll root out any traitors. In the meantime, double the watch. I don't want a single suspicious wolf crossing our land without confrontation." Lucian inclined his head. "Yes, Alpha." They continued discussing specific strategies, referencing the map and the intelligence from various scouts. Ember listened quietly, feeling somewhat out of place. The talk of strategic choke points, supply routes, and infiltration tactics was foreign to her. Yet she forced herself to remain attentive, hoping that by understanding at least the basics, she could avoid being blindsided by future developments. Eventually, the tension in the room eased as they concluded the briefing. Lucian and Sybil gathered their papers, preparing to leave for the day's patrol organization. Before they left, Sybil gave Ember a measured look. "If you need any assistance dealing with the pack, let me know. I can't say everyone will be open to the idea of an Omega as Luna, but some might be swayed by seeing that the Alpha's command is supported by his advisors." Ember offered a grateful nod. "I appreciate that, Gamma. Thank you." Sybil gave a curt nod in return, then followed Lucian out, leaving Ember alone with Killian. The Alpha leaned against the edge of the table, exhaling. She could practically see the tension thrumming in him, a physical manifestation of the responsibilities he bore. "Thank you for including me," Ember said softly. He looked at her, the hard lines of his face softening. "I want you by my side," he said simply, then added more quietly, "I know it won't be easy, but if we're to endure as mates, we have to face our challenges together." Her heart fluttered at the resonance of that word, mates. It still felt surreal, yet the warmth it evoked in her chest was undeniable. She searched his features, trying to gauge if he had any regrets. She saw none, just a steadfast resolve. They talked a little longer about the pack's morale. Killian revealed that he had already heard rumors of secret gatherings among the faction that opposed the Union, though he was still trying to track down the ringleaders. Ember's stomach tightened, recalling the bitterness in Marissa's gaze, along with the suspicious glances she had caught from multiple wolves in passing. At last, Killian walked her back to the hallway, the guard stepping aside respectfully. They paused near the grand staircase. "I have to meet with a representative from one of our allied packs this afternoon," he told her. "I'd like to ask you to remain in the main house for now. I don't want you venturing out alone, especially beyond the courtyard." She understood his caution, though part of her chafed at the idea of being so restricted. "I'll be careful," she promised. He nodded, seeming reluctant to let her go. His gaze lingered on the faint mark on her shoulder. Then he inclined his head. "I'll see you later, Ember. If you need anything, you have only to ask." She swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. "All right," she whispered. Watching him stride away, she couldn't help noticing how naturally he commanded his surroundings, how the staff deferred to him with a mixture of respect and subdued awe. The memory of his eyes when he'd first bitten her still lingered in her mind, a fierce glow balanced by an unspoken gentleness. She wondered how someone with so much power could still show such tenderness toward a lowly Omega. That day, Ember spent her time exploring the main house, trying to become more familiar with the place she might soon call home. She was still accompanied by a guard, though he stayed at a polite distance. Several times, she caught staff members or visiting wolves staring, but she tried not to let it rattle her. She knew her presence was controversial. Nonetheless, she forced herself to greet them politely. When she ventured into the kitchens to grab a bite to eat, she found the staff bustling around large pots and trays of food. The head cook, a plump woman named Beatrice, looked startled when Ember entered. "Luna," she said, hesitating over the title, "how can I help you?" Heat rushed to Ember's cheeks at the formality. She offered a small smile. "I was just hoping for a quick meal. I didn't want to bother anyone." Beatrice hurried to wipe her hands on her apron. "Not at all. Please, sit." She gestured to a small table in the corner, one usually used by the cooks for their short breaks. The bustle in the kitchen quieted as the workers cast curious glances toward Ember. Some looked uneasy, others intrigued. Ember sat down, feeling out of place. Moments later, Beatrice set a bowl of hot stew and a piece of crusty bread before her. The smell made Ember's stomach growl. She murmured her thanks and began to eat, aware that the hush around her had yet to subside. She glanced up, noticing the uncertain expressions. Letting out a soft breath, she addressed the nearest cluster of cooks. "I know this is strange," she said gently, "but I'm still the same person I was. I won't bite." A ripple of nervous laughter broke the tension. One younger cook, a teenage boy with flour dusting his sleeves, said, "We're just not used to seeing the Alpha's maiden here, especially you." Ember nodded. "I understand," she replied quietly. "But if it helps, I'm not used to it either. It happened fast." Some of them murmured in agreement. Another cook spoke up, her wrinkled hands resting on her hips. "Is it true you had no idea? That the Alpha just claimed you out of nowhere in front of the entire pack?" The memory of that night still sent her pulse racing. She felt her cheeks warm. "I was as shocked as anyone," she admitted. "I never expected it." A thoughtful silence followed. While not all of them seemed convinced, Ember sensed that at least some of the staff felt sympathetic. She knew many of them had started as lower-rank wolves or came from humble backgrounds, though not as low as an Omega. That small bond of shared modesty might be a stepping stone to acceptance. She finished her meal and thanked Beatrice, then retreated from the kitchens. The guard followed her through the halls until she reached her chamber once more. There, she found a small surprise waiting for her. A slender package, neatly wrapped in cloth, placed on a side table. Cautiously, she lifted the package and opened it. Inside was a leather-bound notebook and a matching quill set. A small card, written in elegant cursive, read, "So you can record your thoughts, Killian." She smiled despite herself, though she mentally replaced the dash with a comma, recalling that she should avoid that symbol. It touched her that he had thought to give her something so personal. She had never owned anything like this, never had a place to put her private reflections. Omegas weren't typically taught more than the basics of reading and writing, But Ember had picked up some scraps of knowledge from the older staff, who took pity on her thirst for learning. Carefully, she ran her fingertips over the soft leather cover, feeling the smooth ridges. The gift was small, but it felt like another thread tying her to Killian's world, a bridge between the life she had known and the one she was trying to navigate. With a swirl of conflicting emotions, she decided to try it out. She sat at the small writing desk by the window, dipped the quill in the ink, and hesitated. Then, in uneven but legible handwriting, she wrote, "I never thought I would live above the Omega quarters, much less as the Alpha's mate. Everything is new and terrifying, yet part of me feels alive. It's like stepping out from a shadow I've known all my life. But I'm scared. There are enemies at our borders, and possibly within these walls. Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough for this." She paused, reading over the lines. Her letters slanted slightly, betraying her unpracticed hand. Still, seeing her thoughts laid out gave her a sense of clarity. She continued writing, letting her doubts and hopes flow onto the page. By the time she looked up from the notebook, the sun was dipping lower in the sky. Soft oranges and pinks colored the horizon. Ember stretched, easing the stiffness in her neck. She had spent hours immersed in reflection, only to realize she was scheduled to meet with Killian in the dining hall for the evening meal. She made her way there, the guard in tow, feeling a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. She wondered if other pack members would be present, or if this was to be a private meeting. Upon entering the hall, she discovered the space mostly empty. A single table at the far end had been set with dinnerware, and Killian was already seated, turning a wine goblet in his hand. He looked up as she approached, and a faint smile softened his features. "Ember," he greeted. "I'm glad you came." She dipped her head, nerves fluttering at the casual intimacy of dining alone with him. "Thank you for inviting me," she said, taking a seat across from him. "The house seems quiet this evening." He nodded. "I asked the staff to keep things subdued. There's too much tension in the pack for grand feasts right now." That made sense. Ember recalled the leftover friction from the morning. "How did your meeting with the Allied pack representative go?" she asked. Killian's expression darkened slightly. "They offered vague support but made it clear they're hesitant about our internal unrest. They're waiting to see if Silvercrest stabilizes before giving us any tangible aid in guarding our borders. I suspect they're not eager to risk conflict with the packs threatening us." She swallowed. "So they're reluctant to help because they think the union with an Omega might weaken you." He sighed. "Yes, that's part of it, though they didn't say so outright. But it's implied. Politics among packs can be tricky. Alliances shift quickly if they sense blood in the water. We have to prove that Silvercrest remains strong despite the unorthodox choice of Luna." Ember lowered her gaze. The knowledge that she was being blamed for potential vulnerabilities weighed heavily on her. She struggled with the surge of guilt, but also a flicker of defiance. She was not the sole reason for all the region's tensions, no matter what outsiders might say. Killian reached across the table, gently covering her hand with his. The warmth of his skin calmed her frayed nerves. "Don't bear that weight alone," he said quietly. "This was my decision too." She glanced up, meeting his gaze. In the flickering light of the candles, the intensity in his eyes seemed to smolder with renewed force. She felt the bond stir under her skin, reminding her that they were connected in ways she had never before experienced. A soft clearing of the throat drew their attention. A servant had approached, carrying a tray of roasted meats, vegetables, and bread. They set the platters before the Alpha and Luna, then quickly excused themselves, giving a small bow on the way out. Ember tried to focus on the meal, but every bite seemed laced with tension. She could sense the darkness looming outside, not just in the literal sense of nightfall, but in the figurative sense of the threats pressing at Silvercrest's borders. Even more disturbing was the knowledge that danger might lurk within these walls too, in the form of jealous or resentful wolves. They ate quietly for a while, exchanging only a few words about small matters. The silence was not exactly uncomfortable, but it was weighty. Ember felt the need to fill it, to address the swirl of unspoken questions. Yet, she wasn't sure where to begin. At last, Killian set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "How are you coping?" he asked gently. "This morning was only your second day in the main house, and you've already seen how complicated pack politics can be." She let out a slow breath, considering her reply. "It's daunting," she admitted, "but I want to do right by you, by the pack. I don't want to be the reason everything collapses. I never asked to be in this position, but now that I am, I'll do whatever it takes to help." His lips curved in a faint, appreciative smile. "I don't doubt your sincerity," he said. "I can feel it through the bond." That reminder sent a warm flush through her. The bond was still so new that she sometimes forgot he could sense her emotions, at least the stronger ones. He would know if she lied. He might even discern the fear she tried to swallow down. She hesitated before voicing a question that had hovered in her mind since the day of the claiming. "Did you ever consider not marking me?" she asked softly. "I mean, when you felt the pull, did you think about ignoring it?" He looked away for a moment, jaw tense. "Yes," he confessed. "I tried to deny it. When I realized you were an Omega, I fought it with everything I had. It seemed impossible that I could claim someone of your rank without risking a complete uproar. The pack was already under strain, and I knew it would add more conflict." Ember's heart clenched at the thought of him battling the bond internally, wanting to reject it. "So what changed?" He paused, as though carefully choosing his words. "The more I pushed it away, the stronger it got. My wolf wouldn't be silenced. I started thinking about the alternative, choosing a mate just for political reasons, while ignoring what my wolf truly wanted. I knew I wouldn't be content. I'd be living a lie, and that would weaken me more than any external threat." She lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry you had to risk so much." He reached across the table again, gently tilting her chin up. "Don't apologize," he said, a rare tenderness in his voice. "It might be difficult now, but I believe we can be stronger together if we survive this storm." His fingers grazed her scar from the bite, and a spark of sensation rippled down her spine. She sucked in a breath, heart pounding, as the memory of his teeth breaking her skin under the moonlight flared to life in vivid detail. In that moment, she saw in his eyes a similar recollection, laced with instinctive heat. Then he pulled away, clearing his throat. "We should finish dinner." She nodded, unable to meet his gaze for a moment, feeling suddenly shy. They returned to eating, though the tension that now colored the silence was of a different kind, less foreboding, more charged with awareness of the bond's physical dimension. After the meal, Killian walked her back to her chamber. The corridors were quiet, and each step echoed with a muffled resonance. When they reached her door, he lingered, glancing down at her with an almost uncertain expression, as if asking permission to step closer. She offered a tentative smile, nerves fluttering again. "Thank you for the notebook," she said, remembering the gift waiting on her desk. His features brightened. "So you found it," he said softly. "I thought it might help, having a place to put your thoughts." "It did," she replied, the warmth in her voice genuine. "I spend most of the afternoon writing." He nodded, slipping his hands behind his back. Silence stretched, the moment ripe with possibilities. Ember's pulse skittered. She wondered if he might lean down to kiss her, or if he would simply wish her good night and leave. In the end, he did neither. He just reached out and lightly brushed her cheek, the gesture as soft as a whispered promise. "Good night, Ember," he murmured. "Sleep well." She swallowed, the touch sending sparks dancing along her nerves. "Good night, Killian." He turned and walked away, the guard posted at the end of the corridor falling in step behind him. Only once he was out of sight did Ember let out the breath she'd been holding. She retreated into her chamber and closed the door, her emotions in a storm of longing, anxiety, and a faint, growing hope that perhaps they truly were meant for each other. That night she slept fitfully, dreams once again disturbed by ominous shadows. She saw flashes of dark figures prowling the edges of Silvercrest territory, glimpsed the hateful glares of pack members who wished her gone, and felt the pulsing burn of the mark on her shoulder. But through the swirling chaos, she sometimes sensed a presence standing guard in her subconscious, Killian, or perhaps the bond itself, protecting her from the darkest corners of her mind. When dawn came, the day was overcast, clouds hanging low and gray across the sky. Ember rose and dressed quickly. She had resolved to visit a few areas of the estate where common pack members worked, hoping to reassure them and perhaps ease their fears. Giselle had mentioned an herb garden near the southwestern edge of the mansion, a place many lower-ranked wolves frequented to gather medicinal plants. She made her way there, accompanied by her ever-present guard, whose name she learned was Rowan. He was a solidly built wolf, quiet but polite, with an intense stare that scanned every nook and cranny as they walked. Ember wasn't sure if his vigilance put her at ease or heightened her sense of danger, but she appreciated that he took his duty seriously. The herb garden was a small enclosed courtyard filled with neat rows of aromatic plants. A handful of pack members were already there, clipping sprigs of rosemary and mint. They turned at her approach, expressions a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. Ember summoned a tentative smile, greeting them with a soft, "Good morning." A middle-aged she-wolf with streaks of gray in her hair offered a cautious nod. "Good morning, Luna," she replied, though Ember heard the hesitation in her voice over using that title. Determined not to be deterred by awkwardness, Ember asked, "Are you gathering herbs for the infirmary?" The she-wolf nodded. "Yes, we're preparing extra supplies in case there are injuries. The healers requested more of the antiseptic varieties because of the recent tensions." Ember felt a pang of apprehension, recalling the wounded scout who had stumbled into the estate days ago. "I see," she said, stepping closer to examine the plants. The scent of basil and chamomile filled the air. "Thank you for your hard work. Is there anything else you need? Additional help, maybe?" The woman exchanged a look with her companions, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. One of them, a younger male wolf, spoke up cautiously. "I suppose we could always use more hands, especially if injuries become frequente." Ember smiled, feeling a spark of hope that they were engaging. "I used to help with chores around the estate. I'm no stranger to manual work. If you ever need an extra pair of hands, I'd be glad to assist." The words were genuine, and she hoped they could sense that. She wanted to prove that she was not simply an Omega who had lucked into a lofty position. She wanted to show them she could still serve the pack with humility, even if she now bore a new title. Her sincerity must have resonated, because the older she-wolf's features softened. "Thank you," she said. "We'll keep that in mind. Forgive me if I was cold before. We've heard so many rumors, and with everything changing, it's hard to know what to think." Ember nodded in understanding. "I don't blame you. This is all new to me as well." They spoke a bit longer about the herbs, the best methods to dry and store them, and the concerns regarding potential warfare. Ember listened attentively, offering small reassurances where she could, though she knew she lacked the authority and experience to promise the pack's safety outright. At least, she thought, she could provide empathy. As she was preparing to leave, the younger male wolf said, "Luna, there's a patch of medicinal sage near the orchard that might need tending. If you have time, you could take a look." Ember glanced at Rowan, who inclined his head in silent approval. "Sure," she agreed. "I'd be happy to." They crossed the courtyard, following a narrow path around the side of the estate. The sky grew darker, and a rumble of thunder rolled in the distance. Ember paused, craning her neck to see if storm clouds gathered above. The orchard loomed ahead, rows of apple and pear trees swaying gently in the mounting breeze. "Looks like a storm is on the way," Rowan observed gruffly, scanning the horizon. Ember nodded. She had always enjoyed the smell of the earth just before rain, but she knew the orchard could become slippery if a downpour started. The thought barely registered, though, because she was focused on finding the patch of sage. She spotted some bluish-green leaves near a patch of taller grass. As she and Rowan approached, Ember thought she heard something rustle in the undergrowth. She frowned, slowing her steps, senses on alert. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Rowan drew closer, placing a hand on the hilt of the short blade he carried at his side. "Yes," he replied quietly. Another rustle, then silence. The orchard was deserted, yet the hair on Ember's neck prickled in warning. The bond thrummed in her blood, a subtle pulse that seemed to heighten her awareness of danger. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination, or if the mate link somehow sharpened her wolf instincts. "Stay behind me," Rowan muttered, stepping forward cautiously. Ember obeyed, though worry gnawed at her. Had an intruder slipped through the orchard? It seemed improbable that an enemy spy would be so close to the main house, yet the tension in the region had been rising daily. Suddenly, a figure burst from the tall grass, lunging toward Rowan with a snarl. Ember gasped, stumbling back as her guard barely managed to raise his blade in time. The assailant was large, wearing a hooded cloak that obscured most of his features, but the savage gleam of his eyes spoke volumes. He was no random wanderer. "Traitor," Rowan hissed, blocking a vicious swipe from the attacker. Metal clashed with a jarring screech. Ember's heart thundered. She scrambled away from the scuffle, searching for shelter or help. Her wolf instincts urged her to shift and fight, but she was untrained in combat, her role as an Omega never having allowed for any substantial training. She could only watch in horror as Rowan grappled with the assailant. The attacker moved with startling agility, obviously trained. With every blow, Rowan was forced back, though he fought valiantly. Fear hammered in Ember's chest. She had no idea where the nearest guards might be, and in this isolated corner of the orchard, she and Rowan were on their own. Tearing her eyes from the struggle, she scanned the surroundings, desperate for any means of defense. On the ground nearby lay a hefty tree branch, likely broken off in a previous storm. Adrenaline surged, and she grabbed it. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, she rushed forward. The attacker was so focused on Rowan that he didn't see her until it was too late. Ember swung the branch with every ounce of her strength, striking the cloaked figure across the back. The impact caused him to stagger. "Run, Luna!" Rowan shouted, panting. But Ember, emboldened by desperation, struck again. This time, the attacker partially dodged, and the branch grazed his shoulder. He let out a feral snarl and whirled toward her, eyes blazing with murderous intent. For an instant, Ember froze under that hateful glare, every muscle locking in terror. She expected the figure to slash at her, to end her life in one swift motion, but Rowan seized the chance to ram his shoulder into the assailant, knocking him off balance. They toppled to the ground in a tangle of limbs, grappling furiously. "Ember!" Rowan balked, voice hoarse. "Get help!" His words finally penetrated her shock. She dropped the branch and turned, sprinting back the way they'd come, frantic to reach the main estate. The orchard seemed to stretch interminably, the path winding between rows of trees. Thunder boomed overhead, and fat raindrops began to fall. The ground turned slick, nearly sending her sprawling. At last, she emerged from the orchard, her lungs burning. She spotted several patrolling guards near the herb garden and rushed toward them, breath ragged. "Attack! Someone attacked!" "Orchard!" she choked out, gasping for air. Instantly, the guards sprang into action, racing toward the orchard. One stayed behind, guiding Ember back to the estate. Her heart was pounding so violently that spots danced before her eyes. She was shaking all over, a tremor of fear and adrenaline that refused to subside. "Are you hurt?" the guard demanded, scanning her for injuries. She shook her head, though her entire body felt on the verge of collapsing from shock. "Rowan the attacker," she managed. The guard took charge, practically carrying her inside. Moments later, other guards and staff members came rushing, alerted by the commotion. Ember clung to the guard's arm, struggling to stay on her feet, to answer their rapid-fire questions about what had happened. Then Killian appeared, his presence slicing through the chaos like a blade. His eyes were wild with alarm, and she sensed his wolf straining at the edge of control. He pushed past the cluster of onlookers and cupped Ember's face in his hands. "Ember," he demanded, voice raw. "What happened?" She swallowed, tears threatening to spill as the enormity of the attack crashed over her. "Rowan Orchard someone attacked," she stammered. Killian growled, the sound a fierce rumble that sent the onlookers shrinking back in fear. "Did they hurt you?" he asked, voice trembling with rage and concern. She shook her head. "Rowan saved me," she whispered. "He was fighting them." Without another word, Killian whirled on his heels, barking orders to a group of guards to go reinforce the orchard and secure the area. He then turned back to Ember, his expression torn between the need to pursue the threat and the instinct to protect her himself. "Stay here," he said. "I'll handle this." Before she could respond, he was gone, striding out into the storm. Thunder crashed overhead, and the rain began to pour in earnest, turning the courtyard into a slick expanse. Ember watched his retreating form, a rush of guilt and terror twisting inside her. She wanted to follow, to prove she wasn't a helpless bystander, but she knew she would only hamper the search. The staff ushered her to a nearby sitting room. She sank onto a sofa, breathing in shallow gasps. Her body was still trembling, her mind replaying the assailant's snarling face. Who was that cloaked figure? And why had he risked attacking her so close to the main house? Was he part of the internal faction that hated her, or an external spy? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she waited, listening to the storm rage outside and the muffled shouts of guards combing the orchard grounds. Finally, after a seemingly endless span of time, Killian reappeared, drenched from rain and spattered with mud. His hair clung to his forehead, droplets sliding down the harsh planes of his cheeks. Amber leaped to her feet, ignoring the shaky protest of her legs. "Did you find him?" Killian's face was grim. "No, he escaped. We found Rowan unconscious, but alive. He has a few serious injuries and is being tended by the healers." Her stomach clenched. "Is he?" "He'll recover," Killian said, and she caught a flicker of relief in his eyes. "He fought well. He's the reason you're still alive." She lowered her head, tears pooling. "I should have done more," she whispered. "He told me to run. I tried to help, but..." Killian crossed the distance in one fluid stride and pulled her into his arms, heedless of his soaking clothes. She gasped, momentarily stiffening, then melted against him as the enormity of what had happened crashed over her. She clung to his shirt, feeling the ragged rise and fall of his chest. "You did what you could," he murmured, voice quieter now that they were alone in the sitting room. "Rowan was doing his job, and you alerted the guards. If you hadn't, we might have lost him too." She said nothing, too overwhelmed to speak. Killian gently stroked her hair, his touch radiating warmth despite his damp skin. The closeness ignited the bond, sending small shivers through her that were entirely different from the terror still echoing in her veins. When he pulled back, his expression was stony with resolve. "This was a planned attack," he said, voice cold with anger. "They knew you'd be in the orchard, where they were at least lying in wait for an opportunity to strike. I'll find out who did this." Amber swallowed, dread coiling in her stomach. "He could have been one of our own, or someone from another pack." Killian nodded, jaw tight. "We have to consider every possibility, but they won't get near you again." She managed a shaky breath, tears still threatening to spill. "Rowan told me to run, but what if next time there's no one to protect me?" Killian's eyes glowed with a fierce promise. "I will protect you," he said, each word taut with conviction. "I will assign the strongest wolves to watch your every step if I must, and I will personally see that whoever dares threaten you is dealt with." A storm of conflicting feelings churned in Ember's chest. The memory of the fight still made her legs tremble, but she also felt a wave of gratitude that Rowan had risked his life for her, that Killian stood before her now like a living shield. Despite the swirling maelstrom of danger, she felt an undeniable flicker of belonging, a sense that, for all the chaos, this was her place. She rested her forehead against Killian's damp shoulder, letting his presence anchor her in that moment. The wind howled outside, and the rain lashed the windows, as if echoing the turmoil in her heart. She might be an Omega by birth, but the Alpha's mark on her shoulder told a different story. A story of a bond that defied tradition, that claimed her as Luna, for better or for worse. She only prayed that the fury and hatred brewing both outside and inside the pack would not destroy them before they could truly find their footing. A hush fell over Silvercrest in the days following the orchard attack, as though the entire pack was holding its collective breath. Patrols were doubled, guards posted at every entrance to the main house, and discreet inquiries circulated among the pack members to ferret out any sign of treachery. Emotions ran high: fear, uncertainty, anger. Tensions buzzed like an over-tightened wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Rowan survived his injuries, albeit narrowly. He remained in the infirmary, where the healers tended to the deep gashes the mysterious assailant had inflicted. Ember visited him daily, offering what gratitude she could. He was typically a stoic man of few words, but when he finally regained enough strength to speak, he managed a faint half-smile. "I was only doing my duty," he rasped, voice still hoarse from pain. "The Alpha told me to protect you, and I will continue to do so when I'm back on my feet. Ember squeezed his hand gently. Thank you, she murmured, blinking back tears. Each time she left the infirmary, she felt a renewed sense of guilt that she was the reason Rowan had nearly died. However, that guilt also fueled her determination to learn more about self-defense. After all, if there was a next time, she might not have a capable guard at her side. That resolve led her to an unlikely place, the training grounds where the higher-ranked wolves and some of the more skilled Omegas practiced combat drills. The space was a wide expanse of hard-packed earth, ringed by wooden dummies and weapons racks. Soldiers and guards often sparred there under the watchful eye of a combat instructor. When Ember arrived one morning, wearing plain, practical clothing, a simple tunic and breeches borrowed from the storeroom, the noise of clashing swords and grunts of exertion initially drowned out her presence. But soon enough, someone noticed her. The entire training ground fell silent as curious and wary eyes turned her way. Marissa was there, the same dark-haired she-wolf who had challenged Ember's fitness as Luna in public. She stood in a corner of the yard, sparring with another wolf, sweat gleaming on her brow. Her eyes narrowed when she saw Ember, but she didn't speak. Others simply stared, waiting to see what the new Luna would do in a place that had never been her domain. Summoning her courage, Ember walked to the center of the yard, ignoring the awkward hush. The combat instructor, a grizzled wolf with scars crisscrossing his arms, stepped forward, crossing his arms. "Luna," he said, voice cautious. "Luck brings you here." She looked him in the eyes, standing a little taller. "I want to train," she said, steeling herself for ridicule. "I was attacked recently, and I realized that I can't rely on a guard to be with me at all times. I'd like to learn some basics of self-defense." A rumble of murmurs passed among the onlookers. Some exchanged skeptical glances, as if they expected the instructor to refuse. But the older wolf studied Ember's face, his gaze lingering on the scar at her shoulder. "Killian marked you," he said matter-of-factly, "so you're Luna in name. And you want to defend yourself?" "Yes," Ember replied, meeting his level stare. After a moment, he gave a curt nod. "Very well. I won't turn away a willing student, but you should know this isn't easy work, and you might not like some of the things you'll learn." She nodded. "I understand." His eyes flicked over her slight frame. "First, we'll test your reflexes and see what you can handle." He turned to one of the younger wolves standing nearby, a male with sandy hair. "Darren, come here." Darren approached with a respectful nod toward Ember, though he seemed unsure whether to bow or keep his eyes lowered. The instructor pointed to a rack of wooden practice daggers. "Hand one to the Luna and take one yourself. We'll see how she fares." Ember's stomach nodded as she accepted the wooden dagger. It felt light in her hand, the handle smooth from countless training sessions. She squared her shoulders, trying to recall the handful of times she'd watched the guards practice. A circle of onlookers formed around them, some curious, others openly skeptical or even hostile. She spotted Marissa leaning against a post with her arms folded, watching with a faint smirk on her lips. The tension made Ember's nerves sizzle, but she reminded herself that she was doing this not for their approval, but for her own survival. Darren stood a few paces away, dagger held loosely at his side. The instructor nodded. "All right," he said. "Attack when you're ready, Luna." Ember swallowed. She'd never been in a formal fight, not counting her desperate swing of a tree branch against the cloaked assailant. She raised the wooden dagger, feeling unsteady, but forced her feet to move. Lunging forward, she tried to strike Darren's side. He moved effortlessly out of the way, tapping her wrist with his own dagger. The instructor's voice carried across the yard. "Again, but watch your footing. You're too stiff." She tried again, adjusting her stance. Darren still evaded her easily, this time catching her arm with a light sting of the wooden blade. "You're focusing on hitting him, not reading his movements," the instructor barked. "Combat is about awareness, not brute force." Ember winced, frustration mounting. She took a step back, panting slightly. Darren was clearly holding back his full speed. If he had been going all out, she would have been on the ground in seconds. She gathered her courage and tried a different approach, waiting for him to move first. "Better," the instructor said as she paused. "Make him reveal his intention." Darren circled her, feinting to the left, then swiping to the right. Ember barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as the wooden blade passed her ribs. She struck out reflexively, and this time she managed to tap his shoulder. It wasn't a solid hit, but it was contact. A small surge of triumph lit her chest. The onlookers murmured. Darren grinned, as if impressed she'd landed even a glancing blow. But the instructor remained impassive. "Not bad," he remarked. Again, they continued in this manner for a grueling half-hour. Darren went easy on her, but it was still more physical exertion than Ember was used to. By the end, her arms trembled, and sweat trickled down her temples. She had lost every round, but her reflexes improved slightly with each attempt. The final time, she even managed to force Darren to retreat a couple of steps before he disarmed her. When the instructor called a halt, Ember's limbs felt like lead. Panting, she bent over, resting her hands on her knees. Her chest burned with every breath, and her heart hammered as though she had run miles. She was painfully aware of her lack of stamina compared to these trained wolves. Yet despite her fatigue, a slender thread of determination wound through her. "Good start," the instructor said curtly. "You're untrained, of course, but you learn quickly. If you keep this up, you might be able to defend yourself against a weaker opponent in a few weeks." Ember straightened, ignoring the screaming protest in her muscles. "I'll keep practicing," she promised. His mouth twitched in what might have been approval. "We'll see if you show up tomorrow," he said. "If you do, I'll teach you some blocking techniques." With that, the instructor signaled to the other wolves to resume their own training. The group dispersed, though several lingered to cast curious glances at Ember. One or two even nodded in respect, but Marissa pushed off the post and strode away, not even trying to hide the derision on her face. Ember's chest tightened at the sight. She knew that if there was any ringleader of discontent among the she-wolves who had aspired to be Killian's mate, it was Marissa. But she refused to let the woman's scorn undo her small sense of accomplishment. Rowan's brush with death had awakened Ember to her vulnerability, and if she wanted to stay alive and stand beside Killian as a true partner, she needed to learn how to protect herself. She left the training grounds with shaky limbs and a new sense of resolve, ignoring the stares that followed her like ghosts. Over the next week, Ember returned to the training yard daily. True to his word, the combat instructor taught her blocking techniques, how to read an opponent's stance, and the fundamentals of grappling. Darren often assisted, sparring with her gently, though he gradually increased the speed of his attacks as she improved. It was an arduous process, and Ember's body ached constantly. Yet each small victory fueled her determination. Sometimes, when she successfully deflected a strike or landed a blow, she felt a spark of pride flicker through the bond, as if Killian, wherever he was, sensed her accomplishment. Despite her personal progress, the tension within the pack only continued to grow. Whispers of betrayal circulated. Multiple pack members had reported seeing suspicious figures on the outskirts of Silvercrest, though no one had been able to catch them. The troll captains reported that rival wolves might be lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In response, Killian tightened security. He also worked tirelessly to strengthen alliances with other packs, though success was limited. Many alphas simply offered hollow words of support, unwilling to commit resources to help Silvercrest if it meant risking conflict with the lurking threats. News traveled fast, and the story of the alpha who claimed an Omega as mate spread beyond their territory, fueling gossip and speculation. One evening, after another grueling training session, Ember found herself alone in the small garden behind the main house. The sun had set, and the moon was half full in a dusky sky. She needed the quiet to gather her thoughts, to calm her restless spirit. Fireflies danced among the tall grasses, their soft glow a welcome comfort. She sank onto a stone bench, rubbing the sore muscles in her arm. Every part of her body seemed to throb, but there was a growing satisfaction in knowing she was no longer entirely helpless. She breathed in the night air, letting the distant hoot of an owl soothe her. Then a familiar presence brushed against her consciousness, a gentle stirring in the mate bond. Looking up, she saw Killian approaching. He still wore his usual dark attire, but tonight there was a tired slump to his shoulders that mirrored her own exhaustion. "You're still awake," he noted, stopping in front of the bench. She nodded. "Couldn't sleep yet. Too many thoughts." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know the feeling." His gaze traveled over her, noticing the bruise on her forearm from sparring. "You've been training hard." Her lips quirked in a wry smile. "I never expected to become a warrior, but I can't just stand by if someone tries to harm me, or the pack, again." A shadow crossed his eyes. "I wish you didn't have to, but I'm proud of you for not backing down." She looked at him earnestly. "How are things on your end?" A low growl rumbled in his throat, barely contained. "I'm getting closer to identifying who orchestrated the orchard attack," he said. "Some evidence points to a group of radical wolves loyal to an old rival alpha. They might have an informant inside our walls. I'm also aware that a few from our own pack aren't opposed to cooperating with outside forces if it means getting rid of you, and possibly weakening me in the process." Ember shivered, the cool night air suddenly feeling even colder. "It's all so twisted. I never realized how political werewolf packs could be." He sat beside her on the bench, the stone barely large enough for two. She felt his warmth, his nearness. It calmed the quiver in her stomach. In times of peace, it's not this bad. But we're on the brink of conflict, and old prejudices flare up quickly. He hesitated, then reached for her hand. "I'm sorry, Ember, for dragging you into this. If I had known how dangerous it would get, She shook her head, cutting him off. "No, don't say that. You made your choice because of the bond, and I accepted it, even if it caught me by surprise. We share this burden now." His hand tightened around hers, and for a moment they sat in silence, leaning against each other. The moonlight cast soft shadows on his face, highlighting the tension etched into his features, the weariness in his eyes. Yet beneath all that, she sensed a steadfast resolve, a resolution that mirrored her own. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for standing with me. I won't let anyone hurt you, Ember." She nodded, a wave of conflicting emotions tightening her throat. "And I'll do my best to protect myself, so you don't have to shoulder it all." He gave a faint, rueful laugh. "It's strange, you know. Alphas are taught to be protectors, to claim territory, to guard our mates. But you're not a fragile ornament. You're stronger than many give you credit for, including me." That simple acknowledgement warmed her more than she expected. She squeezed his hand in return, a silent affirmation of their shared bond. Minutes slipped away as they sat there, saying little but communicating much through the comfortable silence. Eventually, Killian escorted her back inside, not wanting her exposed to the night air any longer than necessary. The next day would bring more challenges, more tension, but for tonight she found a small measure of peace in his presence. And yet, the uneasy equilibrium could not last. Barely a fortnight after Ember began training, an urgent alarm rang out across Silvercrest territory. It was early evening, the sky streaked with red as the sun dipped behind the forest. Ember was in her chamber, writing in her notebook, when a distant horn sounded, a warning signal the pack used only when intruders were confirmed within the territory. She dropped her quill and dashed to the window. Outside, wolves were already running toward the perimeter, weapons in hand. She saw Beta Lucian barking orders, sending squads of warriors toward the western edge. Her stomach lurched. A rapid knock sounded on her door. She flung it open to find Sybil, looking tense. "Intruders at the north boundary," the Gamma said, breathless. "Multiple hostiles spotted. We need to secure the main house and protect you. Come with me." Ember's heart pounded, but she fought to keep her composure. "Have they breached the walls?" "Not yet. We're not sure of their numbers, but they appear organized." Sybil grabbed Ember's arm, urgency in her voice. "Killian will be leading the defense. Until we know how many there are, he wants you safe." Ember hurried with Sybil through the corridors. Guards flanked them, faces grim. The sound of shouting reached them, echoing off the walls of the estate. From a window at the end of a hall, Ember glimpsed flickers of torchlight near the outer gates, as well as silhouettes moving in swift, predatory motions. "Stay here," Sybil ordered, ushering Ember into a windowless storage room that had been hastily emptied except for a lone stool. "We'll post guards outside. Do not come out until we're certain it's safe." Ember hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to seek out Killian, to know he was alive and safe, but she understood that she would only distract him in battle. Swallowing hard, she nodded, stepping into the cramped room. Sybil gave her a quick, reassuring squeeze on her shoulder, then closed the door. In the darkness, Ember pressed her ear to the wooden panels, trying to pick up any clues from the chaos outside. She heard shouting, the pounding of feet, and, in the distance, a furious roar that she recognized as Killian's. Her heart lurched at the raw power in that sound. Minutes dragged like hours. Occasionally, the clang of weapons and pained howls filtered through the estate, telling her that the fight had become violent. She found herself shaking, fear coiling in her stomach at the thought of lethal strikes and the possibility that some of their own pack members could be killed. Then, a sudden crash echoed nearby, followed by frantic scuffling and muffled curses. Ember's blood turned to ice. The noise came from inside the estate, perhaps down the corridor. Had enemy wolves breached the interior? She pressed herself against the door, straining to hear. Another thud, closer this time. Her heart thundered. She had to decide whether to stay hidden or try to investigate. Her mind flashed to the orchard attack, Rowan lying wounded. She thought of the instructor's lessons, her daily sparring, the incremental skills she had built. If an enemy was inside the house, cowering behind a door might not save her. She glanced around the storage room and spotted a large wooden staff propped in the corner. It looked like an old curtain rod or something similar. It would have to do. Summoning her courage, she eased the door open just enough to peek into the hallway. The corridor was dimly lit by a single wall sconce. 2 guards lay on the floor, unmoving. Ember's stomach twisted at the sight. She couldn't tell if they were dead or merely unconscious, but the sight of their limp bodies shattered her illusions of safety. A figure stood over them, rummaging through one guard's belt pouch, swearing under his breath. It was a tall male wolf in dark clothing, his face partially concealed by a hood. He looked up suddenly, sensing her presence. Their eyes met, and Ember's breath caught in her throat. She recognized that murderous glare from the orchard attack. The cloaked assailant hissed a curse and lunged toward her, brandishing a long, narrow blade. Ember slammed the door shut, heart hammering. A split second later, she heard the blade strike the wood with a thud. Adrenaline roared in her veins. She backed away, hands clutching the makeshift staff. The door burst open, revealing the attacker's snarling visage. He locked eyes with her, a cruel grin twisting his features. She forced herself to remember the instructor's words. Watch his movements. Read his stance. He was poised to strike from above, blade angled down. She steadied her grip on the staff, ignoring the sweat that slicked her palms. He leaped forward, knife arcing through the air. Ember sidestepped, swinging the staff like a club. The heavy wood caught him in the shoulder, knocking him off balance, but not enough to stop him. He slashed out, and she barely dodged, feeling the whisper of steel near her arm. He was fast, faster than she could manage to defend against if she panicked. Desperation fueled her. She recalled the orchard encounter, how Rowan had tackled him. But she was smaller than Rowan, less physically imposing. If she tried to grapple him, she would likely lose. He feinted right, then lunged left, blade thrusting at her ribs. Ember blocked with the staff, the impact jarring her arms. Sparks of pain shot through her muscles, but she clenched her teeth, pushing back. She managed to hook the staff behind his wrist, twisting in a desperate attempt to disarm him. For a moment, their gazes locked, and she saw naked hatred in his eyes. This was personal. He truly wanted her dead. Gripping the staff with all her might, she wrenched it sideways. The blade tumbled from his fingers, clattering to the floor. Triumph flared in her chest, but it was short-lived. He lashed out with his free hand, catching her across the face. Stars burst behind Ember's eyes, and she reeled backward, pain exploding in her cheek. She stumbled, losing her grip on the staff. Dazed, she tried to regain her balance, but he was on her in an instant, wrestling her to the ground. She let out a choked cry as her back struck the floor. He pinned her wrists above her head, one knee digging into her stomach, knocking the breath from her lungs. Her mind whirled in panic. She thrashed, trying to free herself, but he was stronger, heavier. He leaned down, face twisting with contempt. "You worthless Omega," he spat, voice dripping with malice. "You think you can stand beside the Alpha? You will destroy this pack. I'm doing them a favor by removing you." Fear clawed at Ember, but a spark of anger ignited too. Her wolf bristled, roaring in the confines of her mind. She glared up at him through the pain. "You will fail," she rasped. Snarling, he shifted his grip, drawing a smaller dagger from inside his cloak. Ember's eyes widened at the glint of steel, a sense of helpless horror flooding her. This was it. He intended to deliver a killing strike. A sudden crash from the hallway made them both freeze. The attacker twisted around, knife in hand. In the next heartbeat, a furious shape filled the doorway. Killian, eyes blazing with a savage light. A roll ripped from his throat, one that shook Ember to her core. The assailant jerked off Ember, scrambling to grab his blade from the floor. But Killian was upon him before he could rise, driving him back with a bone-shaking blow. Ember gasped, rolling away from the scuffle, her heart hammering. "Touch her again, and I'll tear you apart," Killian snarled, voice resonating with the Alpha's lethal authority. The intruder lunged at Killian, knife slashing. Killian dodged, grabbing the assailant's wrist and slamming it against the wall. The blade clattered to the ground. With lightning speed, Killian seized the man by the throat, lifting him clear off his feet. The hood fell back, revealing a scarred face twisted in hatred. "You damned fool," Killian spat. "You think you can murder my mate?" The man gagged, clutching at Killian's hand. Ember watched, chest heaving, as the attacker's struggles became more frantic. A small part of her felt horror at the savage brutality in Killian's gaze, but another part whispered that the man deserved no mercy for what he had tried to do. "Alpha," Ember rasped, her voice tight. She wasn't sure if she was begging him to stop or encouraging him to end the threat. Killian's eyes flicked to her, and he saw the bruise on her face, the tears of pain in her eyes. The fury in his expression redoubled, and he slammed the attacker against the wall again, the impact echoing through the small storage room. "Killian," Ember said, louder this time, struggling to sit up. Something in her voice reached him. He paused, his breathing ragged, as if on the verge of snapping the intruder's neck. A storm of emotions battled on his face: protectiveness, rage, vengeance. Finally, he let out a low growl and dropped the attacker to the floor in a heap. The man coughed, doubling over as he sucked in air. Before he could recover, a trio of guards burst into the room, weapons drawn. Killian barked an order for them to seize the intruder. They jumped to comply, binding the man's arms behind his back. With that threat contained, Killian immediately turned to Ember, kneeling at her side. He cupped her cheek gently, his eyes scanning the reddened skin. "Ember," he breathed, voice laced with concern. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" She winced, gingerly touching the side of her throbbing face. "Just a bruised." His gaze roamed over her, a muscle in his jaw flexing as he took in the details: her disheveled hair, the frantic rise and fall of her chest. Then, with utmost care, he pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her. The tension in his body was palpable, like a tightly coiled spring. She trembled, relief and lingering terror coursing through her. The feel of his heartbeat against her ear was a potent reminder that she was alive, that her mate had come for her. She allowed herself a moment to collapse into his hold, the adrenaline drain leaving her weak. He pressed a soft kiss to her hair, then whispered, "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." She shook her head, tears slipping free. "You came," she managed. "That's what matters." As the guards hauled the attacker away, Killian helped Ember stand. He kept a supporting arm around her waist, guiding her out of the storage room into the corridor where they saw the aftermath of the intruder's rampage. The two guards on the floor were unconscious but alive, quickly tended by a pair of medics. Broken bits of furniture and scattered items attested to the violence of the fight. "Taken to the dungeons," Killian ordered the guards who held the attacker. "Lock him in silver chains. I'll deal with him personally when this is over." The intruder glared at Ember one last time, hate flickering in his eyes, before they dragged him away. She shivered, pressing closer to Killian. She never wanted to see that face again. Only then did she notice the blood staining Killian's clothing, and she realized with fresh alarm that it was not just from the scuffle. "You're wounded," she gasped, eyeing a tear in his shirt. He shook his head. "It's not bad. A scratch from another skirmish." He winced as she gingerly pressed a hand to his side, feeling the dampness of blood. "We were ambushed at the north boundary by a group of rogues. My guess is this assassin snuck in during the confusion." Ember swallowed hard, fury coiling in her gut. "Then all this was planned." He nodded, guiding her toward the main corridor. "It seems so. But we need to see to your injuries first. Then I'll return to the fight." She balked. "I can walk. You should go defend the territory. They might still need you out there." He gave her a fierce, protective look. "You come first." Her heart lurched, tears threatening again at the unwavering determination in his voice. Leaning on him, she let him lead her to a more secure part of the estate, where a small makeshift infirmary had been set up to handle injuries from the battle. Medics hurried between cots, carrying bandages and salves. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic herbs and blood, mingled with low moans of pain from the wounded. Killian found an empty cot and helped Ember sit, then barked for someone to bring a healer. Within moments, a young woman with gentle eyes approached, carefully examining Ember's face. The bruising was tender, but no bones were broken. With practiced efficiency, the healer applied a cool compress and a mild salve. Meanwhile, Ember insisted that Killian receive treatment for his own wound. He reluctantly yielded, allowing another medic to lift his shirt and disinfect the shallow gash along his ribs. It didn't look life-threatening, but the sight of his blood made Ember's stomach churn. "Now rest here," the young woman told Ember after wrapping a bandage around Killian's torso. "We're still not sure if more fighting might break out. It might not be safe to roam the halls." Ember nodded, glancing up at Killian. "Go," she urged. "I'll be all right." His jaw tensed. "I don't want to leave you." Her voice quivered, but she forced resolve into it. "You have to. The pack needs its alpha, and I'll stay here with the medics. I'll be safe." For a moment, he looked torn, as though every protective instinct inside him demanded he remain by her side. But the chorus of pained voices filling the infirmary, along with the knowledge that enemies might still lurk, nudged him toward action. "All right," he conceded. He bent down, brushing a tender kiss against her forehead. "Stay here, away from the halls. I'll come back for you." She nodded, meeting his gaze. "Be careful." With one last lingering look, he turned and left. Ember's eyes followed him until he disappeared through the infirmary doors, fear and admiration warring inside her heart. He would put himself in danger 100 times over if it meant protecting the pack, and protecting her. Exhaustion weighed on her, but she couldn't rest. Her mind was too crowded with the memory of the intruder pinning her down, the knowledge that some cunning force was at play, orchestrating infiltration while the rest of the pack was occupied at the northern boundary. Over the next hour, the medics rushed to treat the steady trickle of wounded wolves who stumbled in from the fight. Some had slashes from claws or knives, others bruises from fierce hand-to-hand combat. Ember tried to help where she could, fetching fresh bandages or offering water. It wasn't much, but she refused to sit idle. Eventually, the flow of new injuries slowed. Word arrived that Killian and Mushin had forced the intruders to retreat, though a few might still be hiding in the forest. Several rogues had been captured. The pack had suffered casualties, but the infiltration was contained. Tension still thrummed through the estate, but the immediate threat had passed. Night enveloped Silvercrest in a somber hush. The courtyard was littered with signs of battle, overturned crates, stained patches of ground, scattered weapons. Patrols roamed the perimeter, on the lookout for stragglers. Inside, the wounded moaned, and the living counted their losses. At last, Killian returned to the infirmary, looking even more fatigued than before. There was blood smeared across his arms, though Ember couldn't tell if it was his or someone else's. She rushed to him, her heart twisting at the sight of the weariness etched in his features. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, letting her steady him. "We've secured the territory for now," he said hoarsely. "The rogues were well equipped, but we forced them back." Ember guided him to a vacant cot. "Sit," she ordered gently, rummaging for a fresh cloth to wipe away the grime. He obliged, sighing heavily as he sank onto the cot. She dabbed at the blood on his arm. The harsh lines of fatigue around his eyes softened slightly at her touch, and she felt the bond glow with a faint pulse, as if responding to their closeness. "Did we lose anyone?" she asked quietly, afraid of the answer. Killian's jaw tightened. "A few. Some of our best fighters. Others are badly injured. Lucian is checking on them now. We'll have to hold a vigil for the fallen." A wave of sorrow hit Ember. She had never been so intimately aware of how a pack endured tragedy, how an alpha bore the weight of every lost life. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded, gaze distant. "So am I, though we protected our home, and we caught some of them alive. We'll interrogate them, find out who's behind these attacks." Her mind flicked to the hooded intruder who had nearly killed her, now presumably locked in the dungeons. "And the one who attacked me?" "I'll deal with him personally," Killian said, voice bristling with cold fury. "He won't escape justice." Ember hesitated, recalling the savage rage she had seen in Killian's eyes when he nearly strangled the man. She understood his fury, but a part of her worried about the darkness it could unleash in him. Still, this was a world of wolves, and justice here could be harsh. They said little more that night. Exhaustion and grief weighed heavily on everyone. Eventually, the medics insisted they both rest, though sleep was elusive. Ember dozed fitfully on the cot beside Killian's, listening to the moans of the injured, the hushed voices of healers, the quiet sobs of grieving pack members. In the days that followed, Silvercrest mourned the fallen and tended to the wounded. Vigil fires burned in the courtyard each night, a solemn reminder of the sacrifices made. Killian led the rites, his stoic demeanor betraying little, yet Ember sensed the burden on his heart. Meanwhile, the captured rogues, including the one who had attacked Ember, were interrogated in the dungeons. Rumors spread that at least one had confessed to acting under orders from a rival alpha who despised Killian's leadership and despised the idea of an Omega Luna even more. The infiltration had been planned to coincide with the assault on the north boundary, hoping to kill Ember and create chaos within Silvercrest's ranks. During that time, Ember persisted in her training, though the mood in the yard was more somber than ever. The instructor grunted approval at her progress, though he often muttered that it was a shame the pack was forced into such a state. She caught glimpses of Marissa now and then, still full of scorn, but the she-wolf no longer openly antagonized Ember. Perhaps the seriousness of the conflict had overshadowed petty jealousies, or perhaps Marissa was biding her time. Yet the greatest shift occurred when Ember accompanied Killian to a small memorial gathering for the deceased. It was held at twilight, near a quiet clearing on the estate's edge, where the pack sometimes honored their dead. Torches flickered, illuminating carved stones bearing the names of those who had fallen. Killian stood at the center of the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke words of remembrance. Ember was at his side, heart heavy with sorrow. Despite the tension still swirling around her, she felt compelled to join him, to show solidarity with the rest of the pack. After the final blessing, the crowd slowly dispersed, some weeping softly, others murmuring among themselves. Ember lingered, letting the torchlight play across the names etched in the memorial stones. The knowledge that these wolves died protecting their home, and that the pack still risked further attacks, sat like a weight on her chest. "Luna," someone said from behind. She turned to find a young female wolf, eyes red from crying, looking at her with a mix of grief and a curious sort of respect. "Thank you for standing here with us," the young woman said, voice trembling. "My brother, he admired the Alpha. He died fighting to protect Silvercrest." Ember swallowed, unsure what words could possibly ease that pain. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she murmured. The girl nodded, wiping her tears. "Your presence, it might help calm the pack. Many are still unsure about you, but seeing you mourn with us, it means something." Tears pricked Ember's own eyes. She gently rested a hand on the girl's shoulder. "I care about this pack," she whispered. "I want to protect it just as much as your brother did." The girl offered a watery smile, then slipped away into the darkness. Ember stood there, heart aching, as she realized that for all the hostility and suspicion, some wolves saw her for what she was, an outsider trying to become part of their family. Perhaps, in time, more of them might accept her, if she could prove her dedication. Killian found her a moment later, his eyes reflecting the torchlight. "You stayed," he noted softly. She nodded. "I wanted to pay my respects." He offered his arm, and she looped hers through it. Together, they left the memorial site, walking toward the main house. The night was cool, a light breeze stirring the trees. She could feel the tension still thrumming through him, but also a quiet sense of gratitude that she had come. In the following days, the pack slowly began to adjust to the aftermath of the battle. Patrols remained on high alert, and Killian, Lucian, and Sybil coordinated with neighboring friendly packs to tighten security. That support was more forthcoming now, as other alphas realized the threat was genuine, and that Silvercrest, despite the controversy over its Luna, was far from weak. More surprisingly, Ember noticed subtle changes in how the pack treated her. Several warriors who had once stared at her with mistrust now gave her a respectful nod in passing. Some lower-ranked wolves even asked her for small favors or tasks, no longer avoiding her as though she were a bad omen. The orchard attack and the infiltration had rattled everyone, and perhaps it reminded them that their true enemies lay outside Silvercrest's borders, not in the form of an Omega marked by the Alpha. However, acceptance was not universal. A faction remained staunchly opposed to Ember, though their voices grew quieter in public. Rumors continued to swirl of clandestine meetings, though no direct challenges surfaced. Killian, for his part, did not let his guard down, nor did he show any mercy to the conspirators he rooted out. More than a few times, Ember overheard references to exiles or punishments carried out in private. She shuddered at the severity of it all, but understood that in the werewolf hierarchy, strong leadership often meant harsh decisions. One gray morning, Ember found herself in the orchard again, though this time it was calm and peaceful. The leaves rustled gently, and a few half-free apples swayed from the branches. She had gone to check on the medicinal sage patch, accompanied by Rowan, who was finally well enough to resume partial duties. He limped slightly, a bandage still visible under his shirt, but his spirit remained unbroken. "Feels strange to be back here," Ember murmured, remembering the terror of the attack not so long ago. Rowan gave a curt nod. "If you're uneasy, we can leave," he offered. She shook her head. "No, I'm tired of running." He studied her with something akin to quiet respect. "You've changed, Luna." She glanced at him, a hint of a smile tugging her lips. "I'm still Ember," she said softly. "Maybe just a bit braver." He inclined his head, accepting that answer. They walked deeper into the orchard, scanning for any signs of disturbance. Everything seemed normal, the only sounds being the occasional bird call and the soft crunch of their footsteps on the grassy path. They reached the small clearing where the sage grew. Ember knelt to inspect the plants, noting with satisfaction that they thrived despite recent events. When she rose, she heard footsteps approaching from behind, and turned to see Killian striding toward them. Her heart fluttered, as it always did when she saw him. His expression was intent, but not grim. She noticed how the orchard's dappled light softened the hard edges of his features. "Checking on the herbs?" he asked, stopping by her side. She nodded. "They look healthy. Our healers will be glad." Rowan respectfully stepped a short distance away, giving them privacy while staying vigilant. Killian glanced at the patch of sage, then turned his attention back to Ember. "I wanted to tell you something," he said, voice quietly determined. Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" He inhaled, as if steadying himself. "We've uncovered more details from the captured rogues. The rival Alpha is planning to make one final push against us, but not with outright warfare. He hopes to undermine Silvercrest from the inside. He's spreading false rumors that your presence has weakened our pack's stability, that we're on the verge of fracturing, and that the union with an Omega is a sign of desperation." Ember felt a spark of anger. "That's ridiculous." "We repelled their infiltration, and the pack is still standing." "Yes, but some remain susceptible to that propaganda," Killian continued, exhaling heavily. "I fear more violence might erupt if we don't send a strong message of unity." She understood. The best way to counter a challenge was to show an unbreakable front. "So what do we do?" His eyes locked on hers, and the intensity there made her breath catch. "We hold a binding ceremony," he said. "A formal ritual in front of the entire pack to solidify our bond as Alpha and Luna. It's more than just me marking you. This is a sacred tradition that cements the mate bond in the eyes of all. It would be a statement to the pack and to our enemies that we are united. That this is no fleeting claim." Ember's heart pounded. She had heard whispers of the binding ceremony in old stories, a solemn rite that usually took place for an Alpha's official mate, often a grand affair signifying the new Luna's place beside him. It was a deeper expression of the bond, witnessed by the entire pack under the moon's blessing. A swirl of conflicting feelings tore through her: excitement, fear, and a tender joy. She managed, voice trembling. "Isn't that going to stir more hostility from those who already hate me?" He stepped closer, lifting her chin gently. "Let them hate," he said, voice unwavering. "They can't defy the combined will of an Alpha and a Luna who stand firm. This ceremony isn't just for show. It's a vow I make to you, and you to me, in front of everyone. They'll have no choice but to accept it or leave." Silvercrest. A lung formed in Ember's throat. Her mind flashed with memories of everything that had happened. The orchard attack, the infiltration, the scorn, the mistrust. And yet, in Killian's presence, she felt an undeniable sense of rightness, an echo of the night he marked her under the harvest moon. A tear escaped down her cheek. She hoped it was one of relief, or maybe acceptance, not just lingering fear. "Then yes," she said softly. "I'll do it. I'll stand beside you." A slow, relieved smile curved his lips. He brushed the tear away with his thumb, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. The orchard swayed around them, the sunlight catching the red highlights in his dark hair. Ember closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his nearness sink in, letting the bond hum with renewed energy. Rowan tactfully pretended not to notice. Killian stepped back, clearing his throat, a glimmer of resolve sharpening his gaze. "We'll announce it at dusk. The ceremony should take place soon, before our enemies seize another chance to sow discord." Ember nodded, her heart still fluttering. "All right, I'll prepare." They walked back toward the estate together, side by side, Rowan trailing behind. The orchard no longer felt like a place of fear. Instead, it felt like the threshold of a new beginning, one that might seal their fates irrevocably. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Killian called the entire pack to gather in the main courtyard. Word spread quickly, and soon wolves of all ranks assembled, murmuring in anticipation. Torches flared to life, illuminating the open space in a flickering golden glow. Ember stood at Killian's side, nerves buzzing through her like charged lightning. She wore a simple white dress, borrowed from the estate's storage, a delicate shawl draped over her shoulders. Around them, Lucian and Sybil hovered protectively, along with a few other high-ranking wolves. When the courtyard was filled to capacity, Killian stepped forward, raising his arms for silence. A hush fell, punctuated only by the distant crackle of flames. "My brothers and sisters of Silvercrest," he began, voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We have faced grave threats. Enemies seek to tear us apart, to erode our unity by exploiting doubts and fears. They have targeted my mate, your Luna, believing that our bond is a weakness." A subdued murmur stirred, and Ember felt the weight of the crowd's collective gaze. But Killian's voice rang out with unwavering conviction. "They are mistaken," he said. "Today, under the eyes of all present, I swear a binding vow with Ember. We have already been marked as mates, but tonight we affirm that bond in the presence of the pack and under the blessing of the moon." He reached for Ember's hand, drawing her forward. She clung to him, heart pounding so loudly she wondered if the entire pack could hear it. The torches seemed to glow brighter, as if the night itself held its breath. "Step forward, Ember," Killian said softly, guiding her to stand before him. She did so, breathing shakily, acutely aware of the hush enveloping them. She could sense the tension among the onlookers, some still hostile, others curious, and a few undeniably supportive. But all eyes were on them, watching this unprecedented moment unfold. Lucian approached, holding a ceremonial bowl filled with water infused with moonlight herbs. Sybil stood nearby with a cloth and a small blade. According to tradition, the Alpha and Luna would each make a symbolic offering to consecrate their bond. Killian turned to Ember, his voice quiet but carrying power. "Do you pledge yourself to this pack, to stand as Luna for all, to safeguard them and nurture them in times of need, to defend our home with your life?" Her throat felt tight. She found her voice, though it trembled. "I do," she replied, pouring every ounce of sincerity into those words. He inclined his head. then took the small blade from Sybil, carefully drawing it across his palm. Blood beaded on his skin, and he let a few drops fall into the water in the bowl. Ember's stomach clenched at the sight, but she recalled this was part of the ancient vow, symbolizing the Alpha's lifeblood pledged to protect his mate and his pack. Next, Sybil extended the blade to Ember. Her heart pounded, but she steadied her hand and repeated the motion, wincing as the blade cut her palm. She held her hand over the bowl, letting droplets of her blood mingle with Killian's. A faint red swirl spread through the water. Lucian, standing as a witness, lifted the bowl, intoning the old words of blessing. So the Alpha and Luna pledged their lifeblood to one another, and to Silvercrest. May the moon bear witness. At that moment, the full moon, previously hidden by clouds, emerged, bathing the courtyard in silvery light. A collective hush ran through the pack. Ember felt a sudden jolt of energy race along her spine, as if the mate bond responded to the moon's presence. Killian set the bowl aside and gently took Ember's wounded palm in his. He leaned down, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to the cut. Heat flared along her skin, and she realized with awe that the bond was surging, the wound already beginning to close. She returned the gesture, lifting his hand to her lips, mindful not to flinch at the coppery tang of blood. Something primal and ancient stirred in her as she felt the bond tighten between them, weaving them even closer than before. "This vow transcends all rank," Killian announced, his voice ringing with an authority that brooked no dissent. "Ember is my mate. I am her Alpha, but she is also my equal in this bond. Let any who challenge her know they challenge me, and let any who question her worth see that the moon itself bears witness to her place at my side." A ripple went through the crowd, part awe, part trepidation. In the front, Ember saw some wolves bow their heads, acknowledging the vow. Others stood stiffly, obviously struggling to accept it. But no one spoke out. Then, in a gesture of finality, Killian drew her into his arms and pressed his lips to hers, sealing the binding ceremony with a kiss under the moonlight. Ember felt a shock of warmth bloom in her chest, the bond roaring to life in a rush of sensation that eclipsed everything else for a heartbeat. She melted into him, aware that the entire pack was watching, but unable to think about anything except the surge of unity, of belonging, of devotion that pulsed between them. When they pulled apart, the courtyard resounded with a mixture of howls, applause, and stunned silence. Ember's cheeks burned, but she felt no shame. Something deeper than tradition or politics bound her to Killian now. Something that transcended the rank she was born into. Lucian and Sybil stepped forward, leading the pack in a formal chant of acceptance. Some joined willingly, others more reluctantly, but the combined voices rose into the night air. Ember felt tears prick her eyes, a potent cocktail of relief and gratitude. As the chant subsided, Killian laced his fingers with hers, turning to face the pack. "Hear me now," he declared. "Silvercrest stands united. Any who threaten our peace, or our Luna, will be met with the full strength of this bond." A second wave of howls and cheers erupted. Ember's gaze swept across the faces of the pack, some exultant, some resigned, a few still bearing resentment. But a majority seemed moved by the raw power of the ceremony, by the spectacle of an Alpha and Luna bound in blood under the moon. It was a potent message for allies and enemies alike. An Omega had become the Luna of Silvercrest, defying every law and tradition. And yet she stood there, claimed by the Alpha's vow, recognized beneath the moon's blessing, unwavering in her commitment to protect the pack. In that moment, Ember realized that while there would still be challenges ahead, rival packs to contend with, internal factions yet to be fully quelled, and the general uncertainty of living under constant threats, she was no longer alone. She had found a place among these wolves, a place at Killian's side, no longer hidden in the shadows of the Omega quarters. That night, as the moon lingered overhead and the pack gradually dispersed, Ember and Killian lingered by the courtyard's edge. He looked down at her, a rare, unguarded smile curving his lips. "Thank you," he said, voice hushed so only she could hear, "for trusting me, for accepting this life, no matter how difficult." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for seeing me when no one else would, for giving me a chance to be more than an Omega." Their eyes locked, and she felt the bond pulse once more, a steady, reassuring current of warmth in her veins. Whatever dangers waited beyond Silvercrest's borders, whatever plots still lingered within, they would face them as Alpha and Luna.